Good evening, night wanderers. You've stumbled into a place where time softens and shadows thicken. Out there, the world insists on speed traffic lights, elevator doors, screens that glow too bright. But here, in this broadcast, nothing rushes. Here, every silence is allowed to breathe. Tonight, I have 7 tales for you. 7 doors you can step through, though you may not wish to see what waits on the other side. A late bus that should never have stopped. An elevator that refuses to let you ride alone. A mirror that reflects more than your face. A last meal no mother should ever serve. A garden where statues listen when you speak. A doctor who left behind something hungry in the dark. And a rhythm at the door that will not stop until you answer. So, settle back, turn off the lights, leave the window just slightly open, and let the night do what it does best. Whisper, wait, and take. The ghost in the carpool lane. The freeway was a river of red. Brake lights stretched for miles, each one bleeding into the next. A chain of weary commuters inching forward on the 405. The sun had just dipped low enough to smear the sky with copper and violet, but it didn't matter. Down here, under the weight of smog and steel, twilight felt more like a lid being shut. Daniel rubbed his eyes with one hand, his knuckles gritty with exhaustion. He'd left the office too late again, and traffic was worse than usual. His dashboard clock glowed 4:32 p.m. All he wanted was to get home, peel off his tie, and sit in silence for just 1 hour before the cycle began again. But silence was impossible on this road. Engines growled, horns barked. Somewhere a motorcycle wailed between lanes, slicing too close. The radio buzzed faintly with static, the station slipping in and out, and even the air conditioning had a tired wheeze to it, rattling as though the car itself was sick of the commute. To his left stretched the HOV lane, the carpool lane, marked with its white diamond, smooth and nearly empty, while every other lane crawled. 2 or more passengers required. Everyone knew that. Everyone had seen the signs promising fines for violators, but tonight the temptation gnawed at him. He watched one black SUV glide past, free of the jam, disappearing down the road while he sat stuck in place. One time wouldn't hurt. One time, Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. Nobody's watching, he muttered under his breath. Just this once. He flicked the signal and edged across the striped boundary. His tires settled onto the open asphalt, and the car surged forward. Relief washed through him as he passed the endless line of brake lights. He almost laughed at himself. See? No problem. No one would care. Just once. Then the dashboard screen flickered. Letters appeared in sharp digital green, cold and clinical, glowing against the dim console light. HOV success. 2 passengers. Confirmed. Daniel's smile froze. His foot lifted from the pedal. 2 passengers? He snapped his head to the passenger seat. Empty. Just the scuffed leather cushion. His bag slumped against the floor mat. He twisted toward the back seat. Nothing but a half-empty water bottle rolling gently with the car's motion. He blinked hard. The message remained. A horn blared behind him, long and angry. He jolted and pressed the gas again. The car leapt forward, merging fully into the lane. The screen went dark, returning to its navigation map as though nothing had happened. Daniel forced a laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat. Glitch. Just a glitch. But the air inside the cabin was different now. It was subtle, like the difference between an empty room and one where someone has just stepped in. Warmer, denser, the kind of change you feel with the hairs at the back of your neck. He gripped the wheel tighter, staring straight ahead as the freeway unfurled like a dark ribbon. And then, from the corner of his awareness, too faint to name but impossible to ignore, came the sound of breathing, slow, shallow, right beside him. Daniel tried to steady his breathing, forcing his eyes to stay fixed on the stretch of open asphalt ahead. He told himself it was just nerves, just the guilt of slipping into the carpool lane without a partner. Nothing more, but the sensation of presence lingered, heavy and undeniable. The kind of weight you could not explain with logic, the kind you only knew by instinct, like walking into a room and realizing too late that someone was already standing there. The sound of the freeway rose and fell around him, the steady chorus of engines and horns, yet beneath it all, in the hush between each passing car, he could hear it, a slow, ragged breath, not his, Not the smooth in and out that came with driving, but something wetter, something uneven, drawn through teeth that had been broken long ago. It sat low in the cabin, close, too close, coming from the space that should have been empty. He tightened his grip on the wheel. His knuckles whitened. "It's in my head," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the tires. "I'm overtired, that's all." But when he risked another glance at the passenger seat, he swore the leather seemed to sag slightly, the way it would if weight had been placed there. His eyes darted back to the road, his pulse hammering. The dashboard screen flickered again. For one heartbeat, it displayed his route home, the same green line cutting through the sprawl of Los Angeles. Then the map glitched, folding into static, before snapping back into clarity with another message. "Passenger detected." Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head. He tapped the console with his finger as though scolding it, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than a faulty sensor. The airbag system, maybe, mistaking something for a body. But the car was not new, and the electronics had never once faltered. Until now. The radio crackled, shifting stations on its own. A woman's voice bled through the static, mechanical, flattened by some digital filter. It wasn't his music. It wasn't even the right station. Vehicle confirmed. Carpool regulation active. Daniel's stomach lurched. He twisted the dial, desperate to change it, but the voice persisted, smooth and cold. 2 occupants required. 2 occupants confirmed. He hit the power button. The radio died. But the silence was worse, because the breathing beside him filled it completely. He pressed harder on the gas, his car gliding faster along the HOV lane, passing the endless line of commuters stuck in their cages of steel. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt worth it. Almost. Until he realized that no matter how quickly he moved, the sound of the breathing never fell behind. It stayed exactly where it was, just inches from his ear. He tried again to glance at the passenger seat. Empty. But his peripheral vision betrayed him. Shapes shifted. A shadow, just barely there, leaning in, the blur of hair, the pale impression of skin pressed against glass. He turned his eyes away so quickly his neck ached. The car ahead of him braked suddenly, and Daniel swerved slightly to avoid riding too close. His pulse stuttered. He glanced at the rearview mirror, checking his blind spot. That was when he saw her. For only a fraction of a second, the mirror caught her face. A woman, pale and broken, her hair plastered to her temple as if soaked through, her lips twisted in a grimace that was neither a smile nor a scream. Her eyes, cloudy and glassy, fixed directly on his. Daniel jerked the wheel, his breath catching in his throat. When he looked again, she was gone. Only his own wide eyes stared back from the glass. He forced his breathing steady, each inhale sharp, each exhale ragged. No, this isn't happening. I'm tired, that's all. Oath. The car's speakers hissed again, faint static bleeding in, even though the radio was still off. The same female voice whispered through the distortion, almost gentle, "You're not alone. You asked for this." Daniel shook his head violently. I didn't invite anyone. He cut himself short, realizing how absurd it was to argue aloud in an empty car, or what should have been empty. The freeway signs loomed overhead, glowing green against the dusk. One arrow pointed straight ahead, bold white letters reading HOV lane. But as his headlights swept over it, the words shimmered, bending into something else for a moment too brief to trust. HOV lane. Forever. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. The sign was normal again, perfectly normal, but his pulse would not slow. He reached for the wheel, intending to ease out of the carpool lane, back into the crush of traffic, back into the safety of being surrounded by other human beings. But the wheel stiffened under his hands, resisting. The tires hummed angrily against the line as if the car itself rejected the move. He pulled harder. The wheel would not budge. The voice returned, whispering from everywhere and nowhere. "Stay in your lane." Daniel's breath hitched. His throat was dry, his eyes burning with fear. He pressed harder on the gas, heart pounding. But even as the car surged forward, he knew it didn't matter, because the seat beside him was no longer empty. He didn't need to look. He could feel the weight of her there now, the sag of the cushion, the cold air pouring from her presence, the faint, wet sound of her lungs fighting for each ragged breath. He stared straight ahead, his body rigid, every nerve screaming to look, to confirm what instinct already knew. But he didn't. He couldn't, because some part of him understood that if he truly saw her, if he truly acknowledged her, he would never leave this lane again. And the 405 stretched on forever. Daniel told himself to keep driving, to keep his eyes fixed on the endless black ribbon ahead, to pretend the world outside the windshield was the only one that existed. But the car was no longer a car. It had become a capsule, sealed tight, filled with something breathing that was not him. The air was damp now, the kind of damp that clung to hospital corridors and accident scenes, tinged with the sour trace of metal and rain. He wanted to reach for his phone, to call someone, to anchor himself to another voice. But his phone sat uselessly in the cup holder, its screen dark no matter how many times he tapped it. No service, no light, just his reflection staring back at him in the black glass. Eyes wide, ringed with exhaustion, the freeway hummed beneath his tires. But Daniel began to notice something strange. The sound of other cars had faded. The crush of traffic that had boxed him in minutes ago was gone. The HOV lane stretched wide and open, but so did every lane around it. It was as though the entire 405 had emptied, leaving him alone, his headlights catching nothing but white paint lines vanishing into darkness. And then the breathing changed. It grew closer, shifting from shallow gasps to a slower rhythm, steady, deliberate, as though someone had leaned forward in the passenger seat, resting their weight toward him. His skin prickled. He clenched his jaw. "Don't look," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Don't look." But the car betrayed him. The rearview mirror tilted on its own, creaking softly, until it pointed not at the road behind, but at the space beside him. He tried to force his gaze forward, but eyes betray the body. His vision darted up, and he saw her. She was there, reflected in the glass as if she had always been there. A woman slumped against the passenger seat, her skin waxen, her hair matted and dark with dried blood. Her jaw sagged slightly open. A wet gurgle caught somewhere in her throat. Her clothes were torn, stiffened by stains he couldn't name. One arm hung limp against her lap, the other twisted as though pinned by an invisible seatbelt. Daniel's breath caught, his chest tightening as though the cabin had lost all its oxygen. The woman's head turned slowly, impossibly slow, until her clouded eyes locked with his in the mirror. Her lips didn't move, not at first, but her voice came anyway, seeping from the speakers that should have been off, vibrating through the dash. "You invited me." Daniel shook his head violently. No, I didn't invite anyone. He cut himself short, voice breaking. Her head tilted further, strands of hair sticking wetly to her face. "You crossed into my lane." Oh, the mirror shivered, its surface rippling like water, and for an instant her reflection split, showing her body broken at impossible angles, bent across a steering wheel, blood soaking into cracked glass. He saw the image as if it were happening in real time, as though she were still pinned in a wreck somewhere, trapped in the moment she died. Then the vision snapped back to her, sitting beside him, calm, pale, waiting. Daniel gripped the wheel so hard his palms ached. "I didn't know," he rasped. "I didn't know the rules." The woman's reflection smiled, the corners of her lips pulling too wide, too cracked. "The rules know you." The car jolted, lurching forward, as though tugged by an unseen force. Daniel gasped, jerking against the motion, but the wheel was locked tight, unyielding under his hands. The speedometer climbed even though his foot had not pressed harder. 50, 60, 70. The lane rushed past, faster and faster, but the road never changed. No exits, no ramps, no familiar signs, just the white diamonds painted on asphalt, glinting in the glow of his headlights. The woman's voice pressed closer, slipping from the radio, from the vents, from the whisper of air itself. "You wanted to arrive sooner, to pass them all, to escape the weight of waiting. The lane rewards you. The lane remembers." Daniel's eyes blurred with tears, the edges of the road dissolving. He blinked furiously, trying to clear his vision. The diamonds on the asphalt blurred together, multiplying until they filled his sight, row after row, stretching forever. The woman leaned closer in the mirror. For the first time, her lips moved, torn skin cracking as they parted. "Now you belong to the carpool." Her breath fogged the inside of the windshield, though she hadn't leaned forward at all. The fog spread, faint handprints blooming across the glass as though pressed from the outside. One print, then another. Dozens. Domene. Daniel cried out, his voice breaking into a hoarse shout. He slammed his foot against the brake. The pedal sank with no resistance. The car did not slow. The diamonds on the asphalt pulsed brighter, glowing white against the blacktop like a string of eyes staring up at him. The woman's reflection straightened, her posture calm, her eyes never leaving his. You drive with me now, and I drive with you. The car surged again. Daniel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the engine and the whisper that filled the cabin. Forever, the freeway was no longer the freeway. It stretched ahead like an endless strip of dark glass, smooth and gleaming under his headlights. But there were no ramps, no merges, no city lights at the edges, only the diamond lane unspooling forever, the other lanes erased as if they had never existed. Daniel tried the wheel, twisting it hard, desperate to veer away, but the tires clung to the asphalt with the grip of iron and the lane would not release him. The frame of the car shuddered when he forced it, vibrating so violently his arms ached until the wheel snapped back into place on its own, his hands useless against it. He gasped, dry-mouthed, tongue metallic, tried the brake again until his calf burned, but the pedal sank without resistance, and the engine roared higher, no longer obeying him. Overhead, green freeway signs loomed into view, their glow familiar until the light of his headlights swept across them, and the letters shifted, bleeding into new shapes. HOV forever, then another, no exit, then another, 2 passengers required. And then, brighter than the rest, searing against his eyes, passenger confirmed. He clapped a hand to his face, blinded for an instant, and the car veered but corrected itself without his control, as if another driver sat at the wheel. When he lowered his hand, she was no longer confined to the mirror. She was there in the passenger seat, fully present, head tilted against the rest, hair matted in dark ropes, blood glistening fresh across her cheek as if time itself had rewound. Her lips moved stiffly, cracking with each word. You brought me back. Daniel pressed himself against the door, knuckles white. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to get home. Her eyes, cloudy and blind yet somehow aware, turned to him. Home, she whispered, tasting the word. I never made it home. The speed climbed. 90, 100. The diamonds on the asphalt flickering like a racing pulse. Tears blurred Daniel's sight. He thought of his apartment, his bed, sunlight in the morning. None of it real anymore, none of it reachable. He pulled at the door handle until his shoulder ached, but the locks were sealed. The glass revealed nothing outside but darkness without end. She leaned closer, her breath damp against his cheek, smelling of burnt rubber and iron. You crossed into my lane, she murmured. Now you are mine, Daniel shouted over the roar of the engine, voice breaking. Please, I'm sorry. I'll go back. Her voice cut through, quiet and final. There is no back. The dashboard flickered again, not with a map, but a single line pulsing with the diamonds on the road. Merge complete. The steering wheel turned on its own, the car sliding deeper into darkness as the diamonds bled from white to red, glowing like wounds opening under his headlights. The radio clicked alive, the female system voice returning, but now layered with something wet and broken beneath it. Vehicle absorbed, lane preserved, 2 passengers confirmed. She smiled, her lips splitting wider, and her hand, cold as marble, settled on his arm. You'll learn the rules, she whispered. They always do. The car surged again, the lane unending, the sound of his scream drowned in the hum of an engine that no longer belonged to him. The freeway stretched without end, the diamonds glowing red beneath his tires, the roar of the engine ceaseless, and Daniel could no longer tell if minutes or hours had passed, only that the road would not release him. His chest ached with every breath, his eyes burned from staring into the dark, and beside him the woman sat in silence, her broken frame steady now, her clouded eyes turned toward the endless strip of asphalt, as if she had always been here and always would be. He tried to speak, but the sound of his voice dissolved, swallowed by the lane itself, leaving only the hum of tires and the faint, wet sound of her breathing. The dashboard screen flickered again, displaying nothing but a steady pulse of words repeating in rhythm with his heartbeat. 2 passengers confirmed. He felt the weight of her hand tighten on his arm, cold seeping into his veins, and when he tried to move, it was as though the lane itself pinned him in place. He closed his eyes, whispered a prayer he had not spoken since childhood, but there was no answer, only the lane stretching forward, always the same. At some point he thought he saw lights ahead, the shimmer of a city skyline rising out of the dark. But as he drew closer, the shapes dissolved into nothing but more road, more diamonds, more red. His voice cracked with a laugh that turned to a sob, and the woman turned her head toward him for the first time, lips curling into a smile that split her face. Forever, she breathed, and the sound was not just in his ears but in the rumble of the road, in the hiss of the air vents, in the pounding of his own blood. His vision blurred, his hands numbed, and the world collapsed into the sound of her whisper. Morning came gray over Los Angeles, the smog heavy, the traffic beginning its daily crawl. A patrol car found Daniel's vehicle idling in the HOV lane, hazards blinking, engine silent, doors locked from within. When they broke the glass, the car was empty. No driver, no passenger, only the faint smell of burnt rubber and something metallic hanging in the air. On the dashboard screen, one phrase lingered, faint and ghostly. Before it too flickered out, passenger confirmed. Later, when traffic cameras were pulled, the footage showed Daniel's car merging into the HOV lane the evening before. In the grainy reflection of the windshield, two figures sat side by side, the driver's face pale and taut, the passenger's features blurred, her head bent toward him. Frame after frame showed the same image. Two occupants, perfectly still, riding forward into the endless lane. The footage stopped there. The next camera showed an empty stretch of road, and the diamonds kept glowing. The landing, the package was light enough to carry in one hand, but the weight of the building itself pressed heavier on Lena than the cardboard box ever could. She stood at the bottom of the stairwell of the old apartment block on the Lower East Side, her sneakers damp from the drizzle outside, her breath still catching from the walk up from her scooter. She tilted her head back, staring into the narrow spine of concrete and wood that spiraled upward 9 full floors without a single window to break the darkness. The elevator was sealed with a yellow ribbon, a handwritten note taped to the steel doors. Out of order, she sighed, muttering to herself in the half-light of the hall, and adjusted the strap of her delivery bag across her shoulder. She hated stairs. She hated enclosed spaces more. But the order ticket said, Apartment 9C, and there was no other way up. The stairwell smelled of dust and mildew, old paint baked too many summers, and the faint sweetness of cooking grease that had seeped into the walls from decades of meals. The light bulbs overhead were low wattage and yellowed, each one buzzing faintly, leaving the corners to soak in shadow. Lena set her jaw and began to climb, the soles of her shoes squeaking faintly on the wooden steps. The banister was chipped and splintered, cool beneath her fingertips. By the second floor, she was already breathing harder than she wanted to admit. The air was stale, warmer than the lobby below, as though the stairwell had no circulation at all. Her shoulders brushed the wall if she leaned slightly. The space was too tight for comfort. She tried to distract herself by counting the steps, but the rhythm only reminded her how many remained. By the third floor, her calves burned, and she paused, balancing the package on her hip, listening to the hum of silence. That was when she heard it. At first it was faint, distant, like the echo of a heavy door closing somewhere above. Then it grew louder, layered, multiplied, until it filled the stairwell, like the rush of a crowd. Footsteps, dozens of them, a constant pounding, in perfect rhythm, as if a whole group of people were descending from above. The sound rolled down the stairwell like thunder, so sudden that Lena flattened herself against the wall, her heart kicking hard in her chest. She clutched the package tight, eyes darting upward toward the landing between the 4th and 5th floors. The sound was wrong. It wasn't like one or two neighbors heading out together. It wasn't scattered or uneven. It was heavy, synchronized, like boots on pavement. Each impact so forceful she swore she felt the vibration pass through the wood beneath her feet. It kept coming, closer and closer, the stairwell amplifying every note until she thought the walls themselves might shake loose from the weight. Her throat tightened. She considered turning back, but the lobby below suddenly felt too far away, as though the stairwell itself had lengthened while she climbed. She pressed herself tighter into the corner, forcing air into her lungs through her nose, quiet as she could, her ears straining to make sense of what was above. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence was absolute. No shuffle, No echo, no creak of wood, just the low hum of the old light bulbs buzzing and the faint drip of water in some unseen pipe. Lena stayed frozen, her muscles trembling with tension. She lifted her eyes toward the fourth-floor landing. The space was empty. The steps were bare. Her breath shuddered out. She swallowed hard, trying to reason with herself. Old buildings carried sound strangely. Maybe it had been the street outside, a subway below, some trick of acoustics turning distant traffic into a stampede. She nodded, convincing herself, forcing her feet upward one step at a time. When she reached the fourth floor, she paused again, pressing her back to the cool plaster wall. She could smell the wood of the stairs, old varnish and dust. She glanced at the opposite wall where shadows pooled thickest. Nothing moved, but the memory of that noise still hung in the air, a phantom vibration echoing through her bones. Lena adjusted her grip on the package, her palms slick now, and told herself to keep going. Apartment 9C. Just 5 more floors. She could do 5 more. She straightened her shoulders and took the next step upward, her ears still straining, her breath catching at every faint creak of the boards. Somewhere above, faint but unmistakable, a single footstep answered. Lena froze on the narrow step, the cardboard package trembling slightly in her hands. She held her breath, listening, but the stairwell had swallowed the sound whole. It was impossible to tell if that last footstep had come from the landing above, or if it had risen from the floors below, carried upward through the shaft like a single knock. She waited, her heartbeat thudding so loudly she was certain it would betray her presence. Nothing followed. The stairwell was quiet again. She forced herself upward, each tread creaking beneath her weight, and when she reached the landing, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone on the stairs behind her. The emptiness was worse than company. She turned her eyes forward and continued upward, whispering numbers in her head, counting floors like charms. 5, 6, 7. She had 4 left to climb. By the time she reached the 5th landing, the air had grown heavier, warmer, as if too many bodies had passed through this narrow space without ever opening a window. She felt sweat gather under the straps of her delivery bag. The walls seemed closer, pressing inward, painted in that institutional beige that turned every shadow into a smudge. Her throat tightened, and she muttered to herself, just to hear a human voice. Almost there. Almost there. That was when a door creaked open below. The sound drifted up from the ground floor, a rusty hinge groaning, followed by the soft shuffle of slippers against linoleum. Lena leaned over the banister and saw a figure emerge from a doorway near the base of the stairs. A man, stooped with age, his frame wiry but solid, dressed in a flannel shirt and loose trousers. His head was bald, rimmed with thin tufts of white hair, his face lined deeply, his mouth bent in a half-smile that revealed too many yellowed teeth. He looked up at her without squinting, as if the dim stairwell light was enough to see her perfectly. "You're climbing alone," the old man said, his voice gravelly but calm, echoing faintly in the shaft. He didn't raise his tone, yet it carried upward with eerie clarity. Lena blinked, gripping the banister tighter. Yeah, elevator's broken." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good. That's good. Always better that way." She frowned. "What do you mean?" His smile widened just slightly, not kindly but knowingly. "If you see them, don't talk to them. That's the rule." A chill slid down Lena's back, sudden and sharp. "See who?" she asked, forcing the words out. "The stair users," he said simply, tilting his head upward as though they were still there waiting. "Always so many of them. More than you'd think possible in a place this small. Sometimes it sounds like the whole building's on the move at once, up and down, until you swear the wood will snap under the weight." Lena's throat went dry. She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "I didn't see anyone. I just heard something." The old man's eyes narrowed, though his smile didn't falter. "You don't see them when you look. That's how they travel. But you'll feel them if you wait too long. Don't stop, girl. Don't give them the chance." And she shook her head, half amused, half unsettled. Maybe he was senile, some eccentric neighbor who liked to spook delivery people. But the way his voice carried up the stairwell, smooth and unbroken, felt deliberate, as though he wasn't warning her so much as reciting something memorized. Her mouth was dry when she answered. "Right, thanks. I'll keep moving." The man dipped his head, his eyes still locked on her. "Good. Keep moving." And remember, don't answer back if they speak to you. That's how they know you're real. Lena's stomach tightened. She turned away, adjusting the package against her hip, her legs suddenly heavy as lead. She forced herself up the next flight, each step accompanied by the old man's words echoing in her ears. Don't talk to them. That's the rule. By the 6th floor, the air was thick enough that she struggled to breathe evenly. Her skin prickled, her senses tuned to every shift of sound. At first, it was only her own footsteps, but soon she realized there was another rhythm bleeding faintly into hers. Not loud, not like before, just faint taps, one tread delayed behind her own, perfectly mimicking her pace. She froze, heart slamming. The noise stopped with her. Her pulse rang in her ears. She looked behind her. Empty stairs. Shadow pooled thickly on the landings below. She turned back, forcing her legs upward, each step slower than the last. The sound resumed, step for step. She clenched her jaw, climbing faster. The sound climbed faster too. Her breath came ragged, sweat cooling at the back of her neck. She thought of what the old man had said, the smile carved into his lined face. Don't talk to them. That's the rule. At the 7th floor landing, she pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath, staring straight at the cracked plaster ahead. The sound rose behind her, pounding louder, swelling into the rush of dozens of feet again, all at once, slamming into the wood until she swore the stairwell trembled. She clenched her teeth, gripping the package so hard her fingers ached. She wanted to scream that she wasn't afraid, that it wasn't real, that she knew this building was just old and rotten. The pounding stopped. She waited, sweat dripping down her temple, until she couldn't bear it anymore. Slowly, against her better judgment, she turned her head. The stairs behind her were empty, lit in that same sickly yellow glow. Each step bare, each landing still, but the echo remained, inside her chest, as if her heart had joined the stampede. She exhaled a broken laugh, pushing herself upright, shaking her head, whispering to no one. 2 more floors, just 2 more. She lifted her foot, placed it on the next tread. The wood groaned under her weight. And then, as if in answer, the faintest murmur brushed past her ear. It wasn't words she understood. It was a jumble of sounds, hushed and wet, like voices pressed together in a crowd, speaking too quickly, too softly, to make sense. Her knees buckled, but she kept climbing. She didn't answer. She didn't dare. Lena's feet carried her upward almost without her permission, her body moving on instinct while her mind screamed for her to stop. The murmurs had died away but left a residue, like a film clinging to the walls of her ears, the shape of words she could not understand but which seemed to want something from her. The package was slick under her palms now, its cardboard turning soft at the corners with her sweat. Her breath came in short bursts, each inhale dragging the stale air deeper into her lungs, each exhale sounding too loud in the heavy silence. The stairwell narrowed as she climbed. Or perhaps it had always been this narrow, and her fear was making the walls seem closer, the ceiling lower, the air heavier. The light bulbs buzzed faintly, halos of sickly yellow hanging just above her head, illuminating only what was directly in front of her. Beyond that, the stairwell fell away into a gray blur of shadow, as if the world stopped just beyond her reach. At the landing of the 7th floor, she paused, leaning against the banister, listening. The wood under her palm was rough and damp, as though dozens of hands had clutched it just moments before hers. The thought made her pull away, but when she did, the wood left a film of moisture on her skin, cold and sticky, not quite water, not quite sweat. She wiped her palm against her jeans, heart hammering, forcing herself not to look down at the stains it left behind. The silence was worse than the footsteps. She strained for sound, any sound at all that would explain the madness of the last few minutes. But there was only her pulse, loud and insistent in her skull. She swallowed hard and took another step upward. The stair creaked, bending slightly, and immediately another creak followed, half a step behind, perfectly matched, like an echo with weight. Her throat tightened. She quickened her pace, forcing herself up 3-4 steps at a time. Each time she lifted her foot, another sound followed, heavier than hers, pressing into the wood as though someone larger was following close behind. She refused to look. She refused to break the rule. Don't talk to them. Don't give them the chance to know you're real. The murmurs returned, low and indistinct, curling around her ears like smoke. She could almost hear syllables now, almost feel the rhythm of words. But the moment she tried to understand them, the sound slipped away, replaced with others, overlapping, countless voices layered into one. She kept climbing, her fingers digging into the banister for balance. That was when she felt it. The banister shifted under her hand, not with the creak of old wood, but with the slight give of flesh. She froze, her fingers spread against it, and realized what she was gripping was no longer dry or splintered. It was soft, yielding, cold. Something pressed back against her palm, the shape of knuckles, the faint trace of nails. She jerked her hand away and stumbled forward, nearly tripping over the next step. Her breath tore out of her throat in a ragged gasp. She pressed her back against the wall, clutching the package to her chest, staring at the banister. In the dim light, it looked the same as always, chipped and peeling, paint curling back from decades of use. But she could still feel the impression against her palm, the echo of a hand that had not been hers. The murmurs grew louder, overlapping into a rushing whisper, like 100 people standing shoulder to shoulder just behind her, every one of them speaking at once. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did nothing. The sound was inside her head, inside the wood, inside the air itself. She forced her legs upward again, stumbling now, dragging herself step by step. The stairwell seemed endless. The 7th floor, then the 8th, but each landing looked the same, as though she had been climbing in circles. Her breath rattled, her chest aching. She thought of Old Man Jerry's words, the way he had smiled with too many teeth. Don't answer them. That's how they know you're real. The whispers pressed closer. She could feel them on her skin, warm bursts of breath against her neck, the faint vibration of syllables she almost recognized. She bit her tongue until she tasted blood, anything to keep herself from speaking, from answering back. The wood beneath her shoes groaned under the weight of more than just her. The stairs sagged slightly, as if a dozen unseen bodies were pressing down on them all at once. She gripped the banister again, despite the dread in her stomach, because it was the only thing keeping her upright. Again, she felt the give of skin, the unmistakable sensation of another hand pressed to hers, and this time she did not pull away. She could not. The grip tightened, cold fingers lacing between her own, holding her steady but also holding her captive. She whimpered, low and desperate, biting it back before it could become words. Her legs shook as she forced herself upward, dragging against the invisible weight that clung to her side. The voices swelled, so close she thought her eardrums might burst, and for one dizzy moment she was certain the stairs beneath her were crowded, packed with bodies brushing past, their shoulders colliding with hers, their weight pressing against her. But when she blinked, there was nothing. Nothing but the same narrow stairs, the same humming bulbs, the same chipped plaster walls. She reached the 8th floor landing, her lungs heaving, her heart raw in her chest, the voices cut off in unison, the silence rushing in so sudden, it made her stumble. She gripped the wall with both hands, her fingernails scratching the plaster. She didn't dare move. For the first time since she entered the stairwell, she felt eyes on her. Not one pair, dozens, hundreds, all of them fixed, all of them waiting. The silence was worse than the noise. The silence pressed down so hard that Lena thought her ears had gone deaf, but the faint tremor beneath her feet reminded her otherwise. The stairs shifted under her weight, just slightly at first, the wood creaking like an old ship at sea. She clutched the package tighter to her chest, her nails digging into the cardboard, and waited for the sound to return. But what came instead was a low groan that rippled through the entire stairwell, as though the structure itself had taken a breath. She lifted her foot to climb, but the moment she placed her weight on the next step, the wood shuddered beneath her, not just where she stood, but all the way down the flight, every tread groaning in sympathy. The banister rattled under her grip, shaking as if dozens of unseen hands had tightened around it at once. She froze, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The silence deepened, heavy enough to bend her spine, and then it broke, not with whispers this time, but with a sound so massive it seemed to come from all sides. Footsteps. Not a few. Not a dozen. Hundreds. They crashed down the stairwell in unison, pounding against the wood so violently that Lena felt her knees buckle. The stairs heaved under the weight of an invisible crowd, each impact reverberating up her bones, slamming into her chest like a drumbeat. She screamed, but the sound vanished in the roar, carried away as if the stairwell itself swallowed it. The air thickened with heat, and the smell of sweat, metallic and sour, the scent of too many bodies pressed too close together. She stumbled forward, forcing herself up step by step, gripping the banister until splinters bit her palm. The footsteps didn't match her pace anymore. They drowned her out, filling every second with noise, a living wall of motion around her. She could feel them brushing against her shoulders, against her arms, invisible bodies pressing so close she could not breathe. The stairwell was packed, though her eyes showed nothing but empty air. She reached the landing and bent forward, gasping. But the moment her foot touched the flat concrete, she felt it shift beneath her, dip slightly, as though weighted with 100 more feet than her own. The floorboards above groaned, bending with strain, and for a heartbeat she was certain the entire stairwell would give way, collapsing under the impossible weight. She braced herself against the wall, clutching the package tight, her breath tearing raggedly through her lungs. And then, in perfect unison, the footsteps stopped. The silence was immediate, absolute, more terrifying than the roar. Her breath echoed too loud. Her heartbeat rattled in her chest. She dared not move, dared not shift even her eyes, because she knew whatever filled the stairwell was still there, suspended, holding itself back. She could feel the weight of them pressing in, bodies crowding inches away from hers, waiting. The bulbs overhead flickered once, casting shadows that twisted and rippled across the wall. For a moment she thought she saw shapes in them, faint outlines of heads and shoulders pressed too close, the shifting blur of mouths moving soundlessly. She shut her eyes tight, tears sliding hot down her cheeks. She thought of Jerry, his lined face, his calm voice echoing up the shaft. "Don't talk to them. That's how they know you're real." She bit her lip until she tasted copper, her entire body trembling with the effort not to speak, not to scream. The silence stretched so long she thought she might faint. And then, as if to test her resolve, the murmurs began again, low and broken, the edges of words brushing past her ear. They were closer than ever, hot against her skin, syllables she couldn't understand yet which seemed to tug at something inside her chest, pulling her toward the sound. She shook her head violently, stumbling forward, forcing her feet onto the next flight. The moment she moved, the footsteps returned, this time not rushing past but pacing her exactly, so many that the stairwell shook with every synchronized impact. She climbed faster, the roar climbing with her, the wood moaning, the plaster walls vibrating under the strain. The stairwell was alive now, a tunnel of sound and weight and pressure, and she was caught in the middle, a single fragile body pressed between a mass of invisible others, her vision blurred, sweat stinging her eyes. The package threatened to slip from her hands, but she clutched it tighter, because it was the only thing tethering her to herself, proof that she still belonged to the ordinary world outside this nightmare. She forced her legs higher, breath rasping, chest on fire, each step harder than the last. At the 8th floor landing, the roar broke off again, every footstep vanishing at once, leaving only the echo of her own ragged breathing. She stopped, swaying on the step, clutching the wall for balance. The silence this time felt different, sharper, focused. She knew without seeing that every one of them had turned to look at her. She could feel their attention pressing against her skin, prickling her scalp, heavy as a hand on her chest. She raised her eyes to the wall in front of her, refusing to look back, her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. The stairwell around her felt like a cage, filled with bodies she could not see, all waiting for her to break the rule, all waiting for her to acknowledge them. Her knees buckled. She whispered through her teeth, too quiet to be a word. "One more floor. Just one more." The silence deepened, as if the stairwell itself leaned closer to listen. Lena's legs shook with exhaustion as she forced herself up the final flight. Each step groaned beneath her, sagging as though sharing its weight with countless invisible feet. She no longer looked behind her. She no longer dared. The silence of the stairwell was absolute now, but it was not empty. She felt it pressing against her ribs, against the back of her skull, a silence so alive it seemed to breathe. She held the package tight against her chest, as if cardboard and tape could shield her from what crowded these walls. The bulbs above flickered as she reached the landing of the 9th floor. Their pale yellow glow illuminated the concrete floor ahead, and for the first time she saw evidence that what she had endured was not a trick of her mind. The landing was scarred. Deep indentations pockmarked the surface. dark gouges pressed into the concrete as though hammered again and again by iron soles. The edges of the steps were worn down in unnatural grooves, each one cupping the shape of a footprint, hundreds of them overlapping until the landing looked less like stone and more like wax pressed by endless stamps. Her breath caught. She staggered forward, her sneaker slipping into one of the grooves. It was too deep to be natural, far deeper than a single step could have carved. She imagined hundreds, thousands of feet slamming into this spot, pressing down until the stone surrendered, all of it happening in the time it had taken her to climb. She forced her eyes upward, refusing to linger, and hurried across the scarred floor. The hallway to apartment 9C stretched just ahead, the door numbers stenciled in fading paint. She stumbled toward it, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror, her mind a haze of disbelief. When she reached the door, she banged on it too hard, the package nearly slipping from her grasp. A young woman opened it a crack, her expression sleepy and irritated, and Lena thrust the box into her hands without a word. The woman frowned, muttered thanks, and closed the door before Lena could even catch her breath. Lena turned back to the stairwell, her chest heaving. The silence pressed in again, heavy and waiting. For a long moment she stood frozen in the hallway, staring into the narrow throat of the stairwell, expecting the roar to return, expecting the unseen crowd to thunder upward and spill into the landing. Nothing came. The silence held. She began her descent, slowly, step by step. The stairs creaked, but did not sag, the banister cool beneath her damp palm. Her heart pounded in her ears as she moved, every muscle taut, expecting at any moment to feel a hand brush hers again, to hear a whisper coil against her ear. The stairwell remained still. By the time she reached the 4th floor, her breath had steadied enough to pass for calm, though her legs ached with every step. The package was gone, her arms empty, but she still clutched them to her chest as if holding something invisible. She reached the lobby at last, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the cracked tiles. Old Man Jerry was waiting near the mailboxes, his posture unchanged, his flannel shirt buttoned wrong, his slippers worn thin. He turned as though he had been expecting her, his smile curling across his face. His eyes glinted in the dim light. "You made it," he said softly, his voice carrying up the shaft like before, though he stood only a few feet away. Lena tried to respond, but her voice cracked, her throat raw. She swallowed and managed a whisper. What are they?" Jerry tilted his head, the smile never faltering. "They're the ones who use the stairs. Always in a hurry, always together. Too many to count, too many for a place like this. But they don't bother those who climb alone." Lena's knees buckled slightly. She gripped the banister for support. "I heard them. I felt them. They almost..." Jerry lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Almost, yes. But you kept your silence. You didn't answer. That's why you're still here." His eyes twinkled with something between amusement and pity. "That's the rule. Alone is safe. Alone they'll let you pass." Lena stared at him, her chest still heaving. She wanted to scream at him for not warning her sooner, for letting her climb into that nightmare without explanation. But the words lodged in her throat. Jerry only watched her, his smile calm, his body still. At last she stumbled toward the exit door, pushing it open with trembling hands. The cold night air rushed against her face, fresh and sharp, and for a moment she thought she might collapse with relief. She gulped it down, desperate for the taste of the outside world. She turned once more, glancing back through the glass door at the stairwell. It stood empty, dim bulbs buzzing faintly, plaster walls chipped and gray. Nothing moved. But on the 9th floor landing, unseen from where she stood, the gouges remained, deep, fresh, and waiting. Jerry's voice followed her as she stepped into the night, so soft she could not be sure if it was real or if it lived only in her mind. "One at a time, girl, one at a time. That's how they keep the stairs from breaking." She walked faster, her steps echoing against the sidewalk, but the weight of his words followed her, clinging to her skin, sinking into her bones. And somewhere behind her, faint and patient, came the sound of a single footstep. The coffin camera. The red light of the darkroom was steady, low, and oppressive, casting every surface in a dull crimson haze. Liam sat on the metal stool, his back bent over the developing trays, the smell of chemicals sharp in the air, seeping into his skin, into his lungs. He had always loved the solitude of this place, the way the world outside dissolved into silence once the door clicked shut. But tonight there was no comfort in it. Tonight the silence carried weight, a heaviness that settled on his shoulders, made his breathing shallow, uneven. On the workbench beside him lay the film canister he had found hours earlier, hidden under the faded rug in Sarah's old apartment. The floorboards had been warped, and when he lifted them he had discovered the roll tucked away, wrapped in black tape, as though it had been meant to be hidden forever. His fingers had trembled as he peeled it open. It was her handwriting on the label, jagged and hurried. Last, Sarah had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. The police treated it like another disappearance, another restless young woman who had simply chosen to vanish. But Liam knew better. Sarah didn't run. She followed things. She had always been drawn to the unusual, the hidden, the parts of the city that no one else wanted to look at. The last time he saw her, she had been clutching her camera to her chest, whispering that she had found something worth capturing, something that would finally explain the unease she carried in her bones. He had laughed then, brushed it off as one of her obsessions, and now she was gone. The canister in his hand felt heavier than it should. He set it carefully on the counter, snapped the lights off until only the red bulb glowed, and began to work. His movements were mechanical, learned by muscle memory, loading the film onto the reel, slipping it into the developer, agitating the tank. The sound of liquid sloshing was almost soothing, like rainwater trapped in a gutter. He tried to focus on the process, to ignore the prickling on the back of his neck, the sense that he was not alone in the room. The film unspooled smoothly, each frame waiting for him, waiting to show him what Sarah had seen. He placed the negatives into the enlarger, projected the first image onto the blank paper, and slid it into the tray. He leaned close, holding his breath as the shadows began to bloom across the surface. At first it was nothing, just grain, darkness, the vague outline of a wall. But slowly the shape sharpened, lines deepening, contrast emerging. His chest tightened. The photograph showed the interior of this very room. The same trays, the same stained countertop. And there, in the center of the frame, was the blurred figure of a person, their back turned, shoulders hunched. Liam's pulse quickened. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the crimson haze of the dark room. The stool behind him was empty. The room was silent but for the faint drip of water from the tap. He forced his eyes back to the photo, tracing the curve of the shoulders, the fall of the hair. It was impossible to tell who it was. The figure could have been anyone, could have been him. He pulled another sheet of paper, slid the second negative into place, exposed it, dropped it into the tray. The shadows rose quicker this time, bleeding across the page like ink in water. 2 figures this time, both turned away, both with their backs visible, their shoulders nearly touching. His chest constricted. He recognized the slight tilt of the head on the left, the way the hair curled just below the ear. Sarah, and on the right himself. His breath came fast, too fast. He reached out, fingers trembling, touching the wet surface of the photograph as if the confirmation of his presence there would undo it. But the shapes remained, solid, undeniable. He looked up again, scanning the empty room, every corner suffused with that suffocating red light. The back of his neck burned as though someone were watching. That was when he heard it, soft at first. So soft he thought it might be the hum of the ventilation system. But the sound gathered, rising in tone, and he realized it was a voice. Sarah's voice. Thin, broken, almost drowned by the rush of his own heartbeat, but still hers. "They're facing us." The words brushed the air beside his ear, close enough that he flinched, knocking the tray and sending liquid sloshing onto the counter. He stumbled back, chest heaving, eyes darting across the room. Nothing. Only red light, empty space, and the 2 photographs, dripping and glistening on the wire. His lips trembled. He whispered her name, barely audible. "Sarah?" The silence answered. He pressed a hand to his chest, forcing himself to steady, forcing his eyes away from the shadows, back to the negatives, waiting to be revealed. He should stop. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stop. But his fingers moved on their own, sliding the 3rd frame into place, exposing it, slipping the paper into the tray. The chemicals hissed faintly, shadows rising once more. His pulse slowed as he leaned forward, his breath fogging slightly in the cool air. The image bloomed red-black, shapes twisting into clarity, And there it was, Sarah again. Her back turned, her body rigid, but something new marred the photograph. A dark stain spreading across her shirt, thick and uneven, seeping down her spine like spilled paint. Not black, not gray, red, so vivid that even in the monochrome print it seemed to glisten, to pulse. Liam staggered back, nearly knocking over the enlarger. His breath caught in his throat, refusing to move. He stared at the image, willing it to be an error, a flaw in the exposure, a trick of chemicals. But the stain remained, a violent bloom that consumed Sarah's figure, swallowing her into shadow. The red bulb overhead flickered once, briefly, and in that blink of darkness Liam felt it, the cold, heavy press of a hand between his shoulder blades. He spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The only sound was the drip of water, steady, patient, and his own ragged breathing. He turned back to the photograph, and in the silence that followed, he realized his heart was not the only heartbeat in the room. Liam stood frozen, his back still tingling where the phantom hand had pressed. The room was silent again except for the dripping faucet and the faint hum of the red bulb overhead. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. He forced air into his lungs, forced his legs to steady, but the pulse that had rippled through the room still echoed in his bones. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion, a trick of grief, the mind playing cruel games when the senses were deprived. But the photographs drying above him offered no such comfort. They glistened wetly, the chemicals dripping in slow beads. Sarah's back turning redder each time his eyes darted toward her frozen outline. He pressed his palms against the edge of the sink, grounding himself, the cool steel biting into his skin. He could walk out now, abandon the negatives, leave the film undeveloped, but his body didn't move. The compulsion was too strong. Sarah had hidden this roll of film for a reason. She had left it behind as though knowing he would one day find it, and if he stopped now, he would never know what she had seen, what had taken her. His hand shook as he reached for the fourth negative. It was slick between his fingers, still damp from the rinse, fragile as a strip of skin. He slid it into the enlarger, aligning it by instinct more than sight. His breath held tight in his chest. The hum of the bulb changed pitch for a moment, a faint flicker, as if the very light resented what he was about to do. He exposed the paper, slipped it into the tray, and leaned close, his eyes stinging from the chemical fumes. The liquid rippled as the sheet sank, the faint hiss of reaction filling the silence. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the shadows began to rise. At first it was just him, his outline unmistakable, the slope of his shoulders, the messy fringe of his hair. He recognized the posture instantly, because it was his own. His breath quickened as he leaned closer, the image sharpening, every detail of his back rendered in cruel clarity. But this time, there was no Sarah beside him. He stood alone in the photograph, centered, as though the whole room belonged only to him and something else. Two dark shapes pierced the image near his shoulders, not shadows, not stains, nails, long iron nails driven into the photograph itself, their heads gleaming faintly, the metal anchoring his image to the paper. He blinked hard, certain it was a mistake, a flaw in the emulsion, but the nails remained, too solid, too precise, as though they had been hammered in by an unseen hand. His chest constricted. The sound came next, not the drip of water, not his own heartbeat. A sharper sound, metallic and final, the faint echo of nails being driven into wood. He whipped his head around, searching the walls, but there was nothing, only the hum of the bulb, the wet shimmer of photographs swaying gently on their line. The sound came again, closer, the hollow thunk of iron piercing into something soft and resisting. He felt it in his body, deep in his shoulder blades, the phantom sting of pressure boring inward. His knees weakened and he clutched the counter to keep from collapsing. A whisper threaded the air. Not Sarah this time, not fully. The voice was low, strained, as though dragged across metal. Hold still, he gasped, spinning, but the room was empty. Still he felt the words vibrate inside him, felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back. His body refused to move, as if pinned in place by those invisible nails. His breaths came short, sharp, shallow. He shut his eyes against the panic, but the darkness behind them was worse. Behind his lids he saw the photograph more clearly than ever, the lonely figure of himself, the nails pinning him down, the wet gleam of the paper like skin, stretched tight. He forced his eyes open, desperate for escape, but the image was still there, developing deeper, darker, until the nails seemed to protrude from the photograph itself. He stumbled backward, knocking into the shelves, bottles rattling, chemicals spilling across the floor. The smell grew sharp and bitter, burning his nose, but he barely noticed. His entire focus locked on that single image, his own back imprisoned in a frame he hadn't taken. His chest heaved. "Sarah," he whispered, the name torn from him, not in control anymore. "What is this?" The faucet sputtered once, water drumming harder into the sink, and through its rhythm came another heartbeat, not his, deeper and slower. He turned his head toward the sound, and for a split second he thought he saw her, a reflection in the wet metal of the sink, a face just behind his shoulder, not smiling, not pleading, just watching. He blinked, and the reflection was gone. The room fell silent again, but the photograph in the tray no longer looked like paper. It pulsed faintly, as though something alive beat beneath its surface. The nails glistened, and when Liam leaned closer, he thought he saw his own shoulders twitch within the frame, as though the image had tried to move. He stumbled backward, chest heaving, legs weak. His body collided with the door, but the handle refused to turn. He shook it violently, the metal rattling, but it held fast, as though welded shut. He slammed his fists against the wood, screaming, but the walls absorbed the sound, muffled it, made it vanish. No one outside would hear him. And then the photographs above him shifted on their line. Not from the draft, there was none. Not from his movement, they swayed with purpose, like bodies adjusting their weight. Sarah's photo tilted toward him, the wet red stain gleaming, as though bending closer to listen. Liam fell silent, his voice stolen. His breath came in ragged gasps. He pressed his back to the door, but the wood was cold, unyielding. The room around him hummed with the weight of something vast, patient, waiting. The negatives still to be developed lay beside the enlarger. His eyes locked on them. He knew without question that if he reached for them, the story would not stop, that whatever Sarah had begun, he would finish. But his hands moved anyway. Liam's fingers hovered over the strip of negatives, trembling, damp from the chemical mist in the air. He wanted to stop, every instinct screaming at him to kill the light, to leave the room, to let the door remain locked forever, if it meant keeping the remaining frames unseen. But another part of him, the same part that had urged Sarah deeper into shadows, that had led her to capture things others pretended not to notice, tightened its grip on his chest. If he walked away, he would never know what she had found. If he developed them, maybe he would find her, or at least the reason why she was gone. His throat dry, he lifted the next negative and slid it into the enlarger. His hand shook so violently the image came crooked, but he didn't fix it. He exposed the paper, slipped it into the tray, and waited. The hiss of the chemicals was louder this time, like breath filling the silence. He leaned closer, holding himself as still as he could, and watched. At first he thought the exposure was a mistake. The image bloomed faint and distorted, the edges warping as though the photograph itself resisted being born. But slowly it sharpened, and his stomach dropped. It wasn't the past anymore. The photograph was of now, of him in this room, bent over the tray, the red light glaring against his hunched shoulders. He staggered back, knocking into the stool, but the photograph moved with him. The figure on the paper shifted slightly, just enough to mirror his recoil, just enough to confirm that it was not static, not frozen. It was a window, a live reflection pressed into chemicals and paper. His breath rattled, chest tightening with panic. He glanced up at the wire where Sarah's earlier photos still hung, their surfaces gleaming wet. They seemed closer now, tilted toward him, swaying without wind. He turned back to the new print and felt his knees weaken. In the image, his reflection bent lower, closer to the tray, but he himself hadn't moved. The version of him in the photograph raised its head, slowly, deliberately, until its face was visible. But it wasn't his. The skin was pale, stretched too thin over bone, the eyes sunken, hollow sockets that leaked shadow instead of light. The mouth curled into something between a smile and a wound. Liam stumbled backward, choking on air, the metal counter digging into his spine. The paper trembled in the tray, as if the figure inside pressed against it, desperate to push through. The sound came next, steady and deliberate. Drip, drip, not water this time. He looked toward the sink and saw the liquid that trickled from the tap had turned dark, thick, almost syrupy. The smell of iron filled the room, sharp and metallic, mixing with the chemical fumes until it clawed at his throat. He coughed violently, tears stinging his eyes, but when he wiped them away, the photographs above him blurred and stretched, the figures within seeming to lean closer, their backs turning, their spines twisting slightly as though to face him. He clutched the counter for balance, his knuckles white, but the surface was slick, as though smeared with the same iron-rich liquid that dripped from the tap. His stomach twisted. He turned toward the drying line again, and this time he saw Sarah's photograph move, just slightly, just enough for her head to tilt, for the back of her neck to stiffen, for the stain spreading across her shirt to shimmer wetly, freshly. He whispered her name again, a plea this time. "Sarah, please." But the sound of his own voice felt like betrayal, like answering a question he had been warned never to respond to. A soft click echoed through the room. The enlarger had triggered itself, the light flashing against the next blank sheet of paper. Liam hadn't touched it. The sheet slid into the tray on its own, the chemicals hissing, and the image began to form. His chest heaved, but he couldn't look away. The photograph revealed the room again, but this time the angle was wrong. It wasn't from the perspective of the enlarger. It was from the corner, low to the floor, as though something crouched there, watching. The photo showed Liam standing exactly as he was now, clutching the counter, mouth open in mid-breath, and in the shadows behind him, a figure loomed. He spun, wild and desperate, but the corner was empty. Nothing but shadows, red light, and the thick smell of rust and chemicals. Yet the photograph still showed it taller than him, bent at the spine, its hands reaching forward, fingers impossibly long, curling as if to touch. The paper in the tray shivered with movement, the figure's hand stretching closer until it seemed ready to push out from the print itself. Liam stumbled back, crashing against the locked door, pain radiating down his shoulder. His breath tore out in ragged gasps. He pressed his palms against the wood, begging it to open, but it stayed sealed, cold, unyielding. He was trapped. The only light was the red bulb above, flickering faintly now, dimmer with each pulse, as if it too were suffocating. The photographs on the line swayed again, harder this time, like bodies shifting their weight, leaning closer. Their wet surfaces gleamed, the figures within bending at impossible angles, backs cracking as they twisted toward him. Sarah's voice filled the room again, breaking, jagged, like static through a broken speaker. "They're still here. They've always been here." Liam pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice came from inside his head now, pressed against his skull, vibrating down his spine. He dropped to his knees, the floor cold and sticky beneath him, his chest heaving, eyes wide and wild. The tray hissed louder, bubbles rising on the surface of the new print, the dark shape inside swelling, its outline pressing upward as if the paper could no longer contain it. And then silence. The photograph stopped moving. The faucet stopped dripping. Even his breath seemed suspended in his throat. The only sound was his heartbeat, loud, desperate, rattling against his ribs. On the paper in the tray, his reflection raised its head and smiled. Liam knelt on the sticky floor, his palms pressed against the cold concrete, his eyes locked on the paper trembling in the tray. The reflection, no, not a reflection. Something else smiled at him, its lips curling wider than his own could ever stretch, teeth sharp where his were not. His lungs seized, air refusing to move, as though the grin itself had reached across the room and pressed down against his chest. He wanted to look away, but his eyes refused. The photograph pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Each throb matched to the pounding in his skull. The silence deepened, heavy and oppressive, but beneath it Liam heard another sound, faint at first, then growing clearer, a metallic rhythm. Tap, tap, like nails being drawn slowly across wood. He flinched and turned toward the door, half expecting to see shadows moving against it, but the wood remained blank. The sound continued anyway, steady, patient, and then, without warning, it sharpened into a strike, a hammer blow. The echo rattled through the room, through his bones, as if the nails in the photograph had found a way to pierce the air itself. He staggered to his feet, pressing his back to the wall, clutching at the shelves for balance. Bottles clattered, chemicals sloshing onto the floor, sharp fumes biting his throat, but he barely noticed. All his focus locked on the photographs swaying above him, their wet surfaces gleaming in the red light. Sarah's picture tilted toward him, her back stiff, the red stain spreading wider, thicker, as if freshly drawn. The image shimmered, almost liquid now, and her silhouette twitched, just slightly. Just enough for Liam to see that she was trying to turn. He shook his head violently. "No," he whispered, but the sound of his own voice felt wrong, like feeding fuel to the room. The moment the word left his lips, the photograph stirred more, swinging harder, the wire rattling as though pulled by unseen hands. The hammering sound returned, sharper this time, echoing with finality. 1, 2, 3 strikes. Liam clutched his shoulders instinctively, expecting the pain of nails driving into flesh, but the blows landed only in his ears, reverberating until his teeth ached. The image in the tray shifted. The version of him inside the print tilted its head again, grinning wider, its eyes empty caverns. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand. Liam's body froze as the figure pressed its palm against the surface of the paper. The chemical fluid rippled outward in concentric waves, but the hand did not dissolve. It pressed harder, fingers curling, and Liam swore he saw the glossy sheet bulge upward, straining as if to allow it through. He stumbled backward, colliding with the locked door. The handle rattled uselessly under his hand. He clawed at it, pulled until his arm burned, but the mechanism wouldn't yield. Behind him, the photographs whispered. Not words, not quite, but the suggestion of breath against his ear, the heat of voices brushing the back of his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness was worse. Behind his lids he saw nails glinting, frames closing in, his own back marked and waiting. The hammer fell again. This time the shock ran through his spine, sharp and cold, and he cried out. He pressed his palms against his shoulder blades, but they were whole. No wound, no metal. Yet the ache remained, heavy and deep, as though something inside his flesh had already been pierced. His breath caught and broke. Sarah's voice rose through the whispers, clearer than before, brittle and urgent. "Don't look at them. Don't turn around." His head snapped upward, eyes wide, scanning the dark room. For a moment he thought he saw her silhouette in the corner, blurred by the haze of red light. A woman standing with her back to him, shoulders tense, hair brushing her collar. But when he blinked, she was gone, replaced only by the stain of shadow on the plaster wall. He tried to speak, to beg her for guidance, but no words formed. His throat was raw, scraped dry, as though the chemicals in the air had burned his voice away. He coughed, doubling over, tears blurring his vision, and when he raised his head again, the photograph in the tray had changed. The grin was gone. The image of himself leaned forward, shoulders hunched, arms outstretched. Its mouth hung open, but instead of teeth, there were nails jutting from the gums, sharp and wet, each one glinting in the red light. Liam gagged, bile rising, and stumbled sideways, catching himself against the counter. The bottles rattled again, one tipping and shattering against the floor. The liquid spread dark and acrid, mixing with the iron-scented drip from the sink. The fumes thickened until every breath scorched his lungs. The hammer fell again, but this time it wasn't a sound. This time it was real. A sharp jolt pressed into his shoulder, hard enough to drive him forward against the counter. He gasped, clutching at the spot, and his fingers brushed something cold, metal. He yanked his hand back, staring at the smear of red across his palm. But when he touched the shoulder again, it was bare, whole, unbroken. Still, the pain remained, radiating deep into the bone, anchoring him to the spot. The photograph swayed harder. Sarah's stain dripped, the liquid spattering onto the floor beneath her print, pooling with the chemicals until the puddle stretched across the room. It touched his shoe, seeping into the fabric, cold and sticky. He jerked his foot back, but the puddle followed, thin tendrils stretching toward him as though alive. He stumbled again, pressing his spine against the locked door. The prince leaned closer. The room whispered louder. The image in the tray pressed harder against the paper, its hand straining outward, the surface cracking like ice under pressure. Liam's breath tore from him in ragged bursts, his body frozen between fight and surrender. The hammer fell one last time. and he felt it, not sound, not imagination. A piercing stab between his shoulders, sharp enough to steal his breath. His mouth opened in a silent cry. He clawed at the door, at the walls, but his limbs grew heavy, his strength bleeding out into the floor. His knees buckled and he slid downward, his body folding against the cold wood. The last thing he saw before his head struck the concrete was the photograph in the tray splitting open, a dark hand pushing free of the paper, fingers stretching toward him. Then the red light flickered and went out. The world returned slowly, like light bleeding through a shutter. Liam's skull throbbed where it had struck the floor, each pulse echoing as if nails were still being driven into bone. He opened his eyes to crimson haze, the red bulb above him flickering, its glow dim and uneven. He tried to lift his arms, but they dragged against the floor as though the concrete itself had grown hands to hold him down. His breath came shallow, caught at the top of his chest, and for a moment he wasn't certain if he was breathing at all. The room was silent except for a faint drip, steady, measured, like the ticking of a clock. His gaze shifted, blurred at first, then sharpening. The photographs still hung above him. Their surfaces were dry now, but their images had changed. Sarah's back was gone. The red stain was gone. The figures in every frame had vanished, replaced by one image repeated again and again. His own, his body, sprawled across the floor of the dark room, limbs twisted at odd angles, head tilted toward the camera as though staged. The photographs swayed gently, though no draft touched them, each one showing him from a slightly different angle, as if every corner of the room had contained a hidden lens. His throat tightened. He tried to move again, to push himself upright, but the weight pinned him still. He tilted his head enough to see the tray on the counter. A new print lay there, glossy and wet, darker than the rest. The image was of him again, but this time he was closer, his face filling the frame. His eyes were open wide, but they weren't his eyes. The pupils were hollow, ink-dark voids, reflecting nothing. His mouth was parted, and between his lips, faint but visible, a thin gleam of iron. Nails. The drip grew louder. He turned his head toward the sink, where the water should have been. Instead, a dark liquid trickled from the tap, thicker now, spreading across the metal, dripping in heavy beads into the basin. Each drop hit with the sound of a hammer blow. His stomach lurched, bile rising, but he swallowed it back, choking on the taste of rust in the air. A whisper rose then, low and cracked, familiar enough to twist his insides. "Sarah, I told you. They're facing us now." He forced his eyes toward the corner. For an instant he saw her silhouette again, back turned, head bowed, hair falling limp. He whispered her name, voice trembling. "Sarah." The figure twitched, shoulders jerking, and then dissolved back into shadow. His body grew colder. His fingertips tingled with numbness. He realized then that he was lying not on the floor but in something else. The edges pressed close to his body, unyielding, the shape of a box. He turned his head with effort, scraping his cheek against the wood. The walls beside him were too near, the ceiling above too low. He was inside a coffin. Panic surged. He thrashed weakly, but the more he struggled, the tighter the space felt, the heavier the air. He gasped for breath, his chest rising fast, but each inhale only filled him with the reek of chemicals and iron. He pounded his fists against the walls, but the sound was muffled, as though buried. His heart raced, and for a moment he thought it might burst through his ribs. Then the camera clicked. The sound was sharp, undeniable. He froze, his eyes darting toward the counter. The enlarger light had triggered again. Another sheet of paper slid into the tray, though no hand guided it. He could not move, could only watch as the image began to bloom. The hiss of the chemicals seemed louder than before, filling the air with a wet, hungry sound. Slowly, his coffin appeared on the paper, his body within it, his face tilted up, eyes wide, mouth parted. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image burned there anyway, etched into the darkness. He tried to scream, but his voice broke, ragged and small, lost against the walls. The drip from the sink kept time with his pulse, steady, deliberate, drop, drop, drop. The red bulb flickered harder, shadows jerking across the walls. The photographs above him tilted downward, every image of himself watching, dozens of pairs of hollow eyes boring into his chest. Sarah's voice came again, softer this time. almost kind. Don't fight. They've already taken you. Just let the picture finish. The hammer struck once more, inside his head, and his vision swam. He felt his body sink deeper into the narrow box, the edges closing tighter. His breath shortened to nothing. For a moment he thought the dark room itself had disappeared, that he was nowhere at all. Only the sound of the camera shutter remained, clicking again and again, each snap like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. And then silence. When the red bulb steadied at last, the room was empty, the floor bare, the sink dry. Only the photographs remained, strung across the wire. Every one of them showed Liam, his body still, his back turned, as though he had always belonged inside their frames. The last print in the tray gleamed wetly. It showed the dark room, silent and vacant, the enlarger waiting. The door closed, but if one looked long enough, in the corner of the image, there was the faint outline of a figure with its back turned, head bent, hair hanging limp, watching. The final draft. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, each second stretching a little longer than the last, as though time itself had grown tired. Miles sat hunched over the desk in his cramped apartment, the glow of the laptop screen casting his face in a pallid light. His eyes burned from hours of staring, the words blurring together, sentences collapsing into nonsense until he blinked hard and forced them back into focus. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, trembling slightly, poised to strike, but his thoughts scattered like leaves before a gust of wind. It was nearly 4 a.m. The city outside was hushed, muted even for this hour, and the silence of the building pressed in. The radiator ticked occasionally, a dull groan running through the pipes, but otherwise it was only him, the hum of his laptop fan, and the faint scent of burnt coffee lingering from the mug at his elbow. His head throbbed, a dull ache that had been building since midnight, but the deadline was tomorrow, and he hadn't yet found the ending. The story sprawled across pages like a wounded animal, breathing but broken, waiting for him to stitch it together. He rubbed his temples, muttered to himself, "Come on, just finish it. Just the ending. That's all," and forced his hands to move. The keys clicked beneath his fingers, uneven at first, then faster, sentences tumbling out in bursts. He wrote of shadows creeping across the walls, of footsteps on empty staircases, of whispers bleeding into dreams. It was raw, jagged, not polished, but it was something. He leaned closer, desperate, trying to hold the thread before it slipped away. That was when he heard it. At first it blended with the rhythm of his typing, so faint he thought it was just an echo. But then it grew distinct, steady, deliberate, a tapping sound, light and regular, like a single finger striking a single key. He froze, listening. The sound came from the next room, the spare bedroom that held nothing but stacked boxes and dust. The tapping continued, slow, precise, a rhythm that mimicked his own, only one beat behind, as if echoing him. His throat tightened. He pushed his chair back, the wheels squeaking against the floor, and stood. The sound stopped immediately. He held his breath, straining his ears. Nothing, just the silence of the apartment pressing close again. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Fatigue. He was hearing things. That was all. Still, his skin prickled as he crossed the room, bare feet cold against the wood. He placed his hand on the doorknob of the spare room and hesitated, the metal cool and slick beneath his palm. Slowly, he turned it and pushed the door open. The room yawned before him, dim and empty. The stack of boxes slouched in the corner, a blanket of dust dulling their edges. No desk, no computer, no chair. Nothing that could have made the sound. He stepped inside anyway, the boards creaking underfoot, and the air smelled of disuse, stale and dry. He waited, listening. The tapping did not return. He closed the door and retreated to his desk, rubbing at his eyes, muttering, "You're losing it, man. Just tired. That's all." He settled back into his chair, placed his fingers on the keyboard, and began again. The keys clattered beneath his hands, words spilling, uneven but insistent. His heart slowed. He began to sink back into the rhythm of writing, the quiet rush of sentences pulling him under. Then, faint but undeniable, the tapping returned. Not behind him this time, not in the other room. Here. He froze, staring at the screen. His fingers hovered motionless, but the words did not stop. Letter by letter, The cursor marched forward, forming words he had not typed. His breath caught as he read them. They described the room, his desk, the light of the screen, the smell of burnt coffee. They described the ache in his skull, the tension in his jaw, the fear rising sharp in his chest, his exact fear. He snatched his hands back from the keyboard, staring at the machine as if it might bite him. The keys clicked anyway, slow and deliberate, as though pressed by an invisible finger. One word at a time appeared on the screen. He slammed the laptop shut. The noise stopped instantly. Silence again, heavy, suffocating. His chest rose and fell, his throat tight, his pulse hammering. He sat frozen for a long minute, then slowly lifted the lid of the laptop. The screen blinked back to life. The document still open, the words still there, and beneath them a new line had formed, fresh and glistening like wet ink. It read, "Do not erase me." Miles's stomach dropped. His finger hovered over the delete key, trembling before slamming it down. The words vanished in an instant. He leaned back in his chair, breath ragged, chest burning. Then the tapping started again. This time it was louder, faster, more insistent. The words reappeared on the screen, filling line after line with startling speed, until the final sentence arrived, stamped in capital letters that glared in the glow of the monitor. "Let me write the end." Miles's mouth went dry. His reflection in the black edge of the screen stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. He did not dare to move. Miles stared at the glowing screen, his breathing shallow, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The words glared at him in block capitals, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain. "Let me write the end." His finger hovered over the keys, but he dared not touch them, dared not give the machine permission, because some part of him understood that permission had already been given. He felt it in the heaviness of the air, in the silence of the apartment that seemed to lean closer, listening. The tapping resumed, slower this time, patient, like the measured beat of a metronome. Each sound was sharp, deliberate, not the random creak of pipes or the muffled noise of neighbors. It was here, in the room, pressing into his ears with a certainty that made his skin crawl. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It echoed in his chest until his own heartbeat tried to match its rhythm. His hand moved on its own, reaching for the delete key again, but he hesitated. The cursor blinked steadily, waiting, the screen a pale square in the darkness. He whispered under his breath, "It isn't real. You're overtired. You're hearing things." But the words fell flat, stripped of conviction. His reflection in the black edge of the laptop seemed to sneer back at him, mouth twitching in ways his own hadn't moved. He pressed delete again, holding it down, watching line after line vanish until the page was white, clean, empty. His chest loosened slightly, a breath breaking free, until the sound started again. The tapping rose, faster this time, insistent, filling the air like rain on a roof. The screen flickered once, then the words poured back, not slow now but in a relentless rush, sentences forming faster than his eyes could follow. They described the act of erasure, the futility of it, how he pressed the key with trembling fingers, how the fear of watching was worse than the words themselves. They described him in the present tense, as if the machine were narrating not what it imagined, but what it witnessed. He slammed the laptop shut again, harder this time, the sound cracking through the silence like a gunshot. His breath came ragged. He shoved the machine away, the charger cord yanking taut, nearly pulling it off the desk. He stumbled back in his chair until it struck the wall, pressing his spine against the cold plaster, his eyes fixed on the closed lid. The tapping did not stop. It filled the room now, though the machine was shut, though the screen was black. Tap, tap, tap. Not random, not mindless. Each beat landed on his nerves, drilled into his skull. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing. The sound came from inside. The walls, the desk, the air itself. He stood, unsteady, his legs numb from hours at the chair, and crossed the small apartment to the kitchen. The floor creaked under his steps. The refrigerator hummed, ordinary sounds of life. But underneath them the tapping persisted, patient and deliberate, like something walking just one step behind him. He turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. The shadows hung motionless. He grabbed the kettle, filled it with water, set it on the stove. desperate for a noise to drown out the rhythm. The burner ticked, the flame whooshed alive, and soon the hiss of heating water filled the space. He leaned against the counter, eyes shut, focusing on the sound, on the ordinariness of it. Slowly the tapping faded, buried beneath the kettle's rising whine. His shoulders sagged. He exhaled, long and shaky, and when the whistle shrieked he jumped, but laughed weakly, shakily, as if the absurdity of it proved he was still in control. He poured the water over instant coffee, hands trembling, the bitter steam curling against his face. He drank quickly, burning his tongue, needing the sting to feel awake. When he returned to the desk, the laptop lid was open. He froze, cup halfway to his lips, the steam rising in thin tendrils. He had slammed it shut. He remembered the force, the crack of it, but now the screen glowed again, pale and steady, the cursor blinking in the document. New words scrolled slowly across the page, not in block capitals this time, but in a neat, careful rhythm. You left. You came back. Good. Sit down. His hand shook so badly the cup rattled against his teeth. He set it down hard on the desk, coffee sloshing over the rim. He whispered again to no one. Not real. Not real. His reflection in the screen tilted its head a fraction too far, as though listening. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't a finger. It was many, dozens, a chorus of clicks rising together, a storm of keystrokes filling the silence. He spun, searching the room, and for a heartbeat he swore he saw them outlines, faint and gray, crowding the edges of the apartment, shoulders hunched over invisible keyboards, their heads bent low, fingers hammering the air in unison. The sound rattled against the windows, against his skull, until it was impossible to know if it came from outside or inside, or if the apartment itself was the instrument. Then, just as quickly, silence. The words on the screen stilled. He leaned closer, heart hammering, and read, "You can't finish it. You never could. Let us. We know the ending." He reached out with shaking fingers and typed a single word. No. For a moment, nothing happened. The cursor blinked. His breath held. Then the keyboard under his hands depressed without his command. Keys sank as if struck by invisible fingers. Fast, precise, unstoppable. The words erased his refusal, replacing it with another. Yes. Miles jerked his hands away, watching the keys move on their own, pressing down one after another. His machine no longer his. His chest heaved. He staggered backward until his chair tipped, crashing to the floor, but he didn't stop. He backed against the wall, eyes wide, watching as his story filled itself line by line, every word describing not fiction, but him, his fear, his denial, his surrender. He shut his eyes, but the rhythm still pulsed in his skull. Tap, tap, tap. The story was writing itself, and all he could do was listen. The screen pulsed faintly, its glow filling the small apartment with an anemic light. Miles slumped against the wall, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts, his throat dry, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The laptop sat on the desk where he had abandoned it, the keys moving in precise strokes, pressing themselves down without hands. Words continued to scroll across the document, steady and inevitable, as if an unseen typist sat in his chair, breathing through the machine. At first, the sentences repeated his fear, tracing the panic of his racing heart, the tremor in his fingers, the sweat on his skin, but slowly the words began to shift, no longer describing him in the present tense. They moved forward, a step beyond his now, as though reaching into minutes that had not yet arrived. The sentences described him standing unsteadily, described the sound of his bare feet on the wood as he moved closer, described the tightening of his chest as he leaned toward the glowing screen despite every instinct screaming to stay away. His throat constricted as he read. He forced himself to remain where he was, pressed against the wall. But the words changed again. They erased themselves, line after line vanishing, replaced by new sentences. He stays where he is. He cannot resist. He will rise. And as if commanded, he rose. His knees cracked, his palms scraping the plaster for balance, his body betraying him. His steps fell exactly as written, soft thuds against the wood, and he crossed the room in a slow, reluctant march until the glow of the screen washed over his face. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, breath ragged, staring at the words filling the page. The document now described him leaning forward, closer still, his breath fogging faintly on the surface of the screen. He jerked his head back, but the cursor blinked, waited, and typed again. Closer. His body obeyed. His face hovered inches away from the glass. His eyes locked on the sentences that unfurled like a prophecy. The words shifted once more. They no longer described his movements. They described his ending. He will not finish the draft. He will not survive the night. His body will slump across the keys. The story will end without him, because it has always been ours. A whimper caught in his throat. He clutched the desk harder, shaking his head, whispering, "No, no, this isn't real. I'm the one writing. It's mine." His denial felt thin, an echo against the steady rhythm of keys pressing themselves. The screen filled with rebuttals. "You never wrote it. You only carried it. We have been pressing your fingers down all along. You thought you shaped the words, but they shaped you. You are the draft. You are the ending." Miles staggered back, his chest aching, sweat soaking his shirt. His mind thrashed, desperate for escape, but the apartment pressed closer, every shadow thick with presence. The tapping rose again, but this time it was not contained to the keyboard. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The sound of countless fingers drumming against surfaces unseen, tapping out the rhythm of letters, of words, of stories written on the fabric of the room itself. The document continued without pause. He will try to run. He will not succeed. He will hear the end before he feels it. He will understand too late that the last line has already been written. His pulse raced. He backed toward the door, his hand fumbling at the knob, twisting hard. It rattled but did not turn. He pulled again, teeth clenched, but it held fast, locked by something beyond metal. Behind him, the keyboard clattered on, faster now, manic, filling the apartment with the noise of 1,000 endings written at once. He spun back toward the screen and nearly screamed. The document had erased itself again, leaving only a single sentence, repeated over and over, scrolling downward without end. "Let me write the end." The words bled into one another, multiplied until the whole screen glowed with them, lines upon lines like nails hammered into his skull. He slammed the laptop shut with shaking hands, but the noise didn't stop. The tapping filled the room still, louder than ever, pressing into his ears until his vision blurred. He clutched his head, staggering, and whispered hoarsely, "Please, please stop." The sound cut off instantly. The silence that followed was worse. His ears rang. His body swayed. He lifted his eyes toward the dark laptop on the desk. Slowly, painfully, the lid lifted by itself, hinges creaking in the silence. The screen glowed to life. A blank page waited. The cursor blinked, steady, patient. Then the keys began to move. One word appeared, typed slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the act. Finally, Miles sank into the chair, his strength gone, his body trembling. He watched, helpless, as the machine continued, forming sentences he dared not erase, sentences that painted the last moments of his life before they had even happened. Each word landed with the weight of inevitability. The draft was finishing itself. The keys moved faster now, a frantic rattle that filled the room like a storm. Miles gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself, but the vibration ran up through the wood, into his arms, into his bones. He tried to shout, but his throat gave only a broken rasp, thin and weak against the clamor. His reflection in the glossy black of the screen no longer matched him. It leaned closer, its face pale, its eyes wide and hollow, its lips moving silently, even as his own mouth remained shut. He jerked back, but the image did not, as though it were the real one and he the imitation. The sentences on the screen grew longer, more detailed, describing each twitch of his muscles, each flicker of his eyes. He pulls back. He tells himself it is not real. He thinks of closing the machine again. He thinks of breaking it. But the draft knows him. It has always known him. He cannot destroy what was never his to begin with. His chest tightened as he reached for the power cord, yanking it free. The screen flickered, darkened for an instant, but the keys did not stop. The clattering continued, though the laptop had gone dark, the letters still pressing invisibly into a page that no longer needed light to reveal itself. He dropped the cord, stepping back, his bare feet crunching on a shard of his coffee mug spilled earlier. Pain shot through him, but even that seemed written, predicted. He turned toward the wall, desperate, clawing at the plaster, his breath ragged. The sound shifted. It was no longer typing. It was drumming, pressing, as if hundreds of fingers struck the walls themselves, spelling words he could not see but felt in his chest. He slammed his fists against the door, but the wood was slick, damp beneath his palms, as though coated in something oily. His breath fogged the surface. He pressed his ear against it and heard the faintest clicking on the other side, a slow, deliberate keystroke, as if the entire building was writing him in. His knees gave way. He slumped to the floor, sweat dripping down his temples. The laptop glowed again, though it was still unplugged, the light rising steadily until it was the only illumination in the apartment. The words returned, sharp, certain, cutting through him. He resists. He fails. He returns to the desk because the story drags him back, and his body obeyed. His legs shook as he rose, each step unwilling but compelled, dragging him across the floor until he collapsed once more into the chair. The wood was cold beneath him, the keyboard warm, humming faintly under his trembling hands. His fingers hovered above the keys, and he swore he could feel them pulling downward, not waiting for him but using him, pressing him into service like a tool. He tried to lift them away, but the weight increased, his knuckles cracking as his hands slammed down, letter by letter, each stroke not his choice but forced. The words appeared faster now, describing not only his fear but his surrender, not only his exhaustion but the shape of his end. He slumps forward. He lets his forehead rest against the keys. The keys welcome him. They hold him. They close around him. Miles gasped, pulling back, but his body bent forward anyway, his spine curling, his breath hitching. His forehead hovered inches above the plastic keys, the smell of heated circuitry filling his nose. He clenched his teeth, forcing his neck straight, whispering, I won't let you." But the keyboard hummed, a low vibration traveling up into his arms, numbing his resistance. The tapping multiplied again, not from the machine but from the air, from the walls, from inside his skull. Dozens of unseen keyboards hammered at once, a chorus of endings all written in unison. The sound pressed so hard he felt his teeth chatter. His vision blurred, the corners darkening, until the only thing left was the screen, the white page scrolling downward with unstoppable momentum. The words grew larger, stamped like commands. Finish it. Let us. It is ours. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. His hands pressed against the desk, his shoulders shaking with the effort. But the invisible pull yanked him back, dragging him down. His chest hit the edge, his breath punched out, and then his forehead slammed gently but firmly against the keys. The letters clicked beneath his skull. Soft, steady, welcoming. He lifted his head once, just enough to see the final line forming across the screen. He is the draft. He is the ending. The keys pressed harder against his skin, leaving faint impressions on his forehead. His breath rattled, shallow, fading, but the keyboard hummed steadily, as though feeding. He whispered once, hoarse and broken, "It's mine, my story," but the words dissolved into the glow, absorbed, rewritten. His reflection on the dark edge of the screen smiled again, a smile his own lips could not form. The keys waited. The apartment was silent again. The clatter of keys had faded into memory, leaving only the faint hum of the laptop, steady and soft, like a breath. Miles lay forward across the desk, his face pressed against the keyboard, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. His body twitched once, a final shiver of resistance, then stilled. The cursor on the screen blinked patiently, waiting, as though savoring the pause before the last sentence. Slowly, the words began again. Letter by letter, the conclusion took shape, though no hands touched the keys. The draft is finished. He has given himself to it. The story belongs to us. The glow of the screen lit his profile. Sharp lines of exhaustion carved deep into his face. His lips parted slightly as if still trying to whisper protest. His eyes were half open, glazed, reflecting the page even as they saw nothing. The room smelled of stale coffee, burnt circuitry, and something sourer, something faintly organic, as though the machine itself had begun to rot. In the silence, another sound returned, soft, rhythmic, wet, a slow scrape across plastic. At first it seemed like the faint shift of his body against the keys, but when the light shifted, it revealed grooves forming across the letters. Not scratches, not cracks, but impressions, deep and sharp, as though fingernails were being driven down hard. Miles's hands dangled limp at his sides, unmoving. The marks pressed themselves into the keyboard anyway, gouging the plastic deeper with each invisible stroke. A sheen glistened across the keys. A thin, yellowish fluid oozed into the grooves, tacky and wet, seeping between the letters until the entire surface glistened with a sticky film. It clung to his skin, too, where his forehead rested, gluing him gently to the machine as though claiming him fully. The laptop whirred louder, then steadied, its fan exhaling a sigh like something content, something fed. The screen brightened and scrolled. New paragraphs appeared, written in a voice no one could name. They did not describe him anymore. They described the reader, the observer. They wrote of someone listening in the quiet, hearing the words unfold, feeling the pull of fatigue, the press of shadows gathering in the corners of a room that was supposed to be safe. The sentences lingered there, poised, until the cursor blinked at the end of one final line. And now you have taken his place. The machine stilled. The glow dimmed. When the sun rose, the apartment remained quiet. The kettle sat cold on the stove. The spilled coffee had dried to a dark crust on the floor. The radiator ticked with the morning's first heat. But at the desk, Miles had not moved. His body was slumped forward, head against the keys, breath long gone. The screen displayed the completed manuscript, the final chapter written in a hand that was not his. The ending was clean, precise, inevitable. Those who found him said it looked almost peaceful, except for the strange details they could not explain. The keyboard was deeply scarred, each key pressed down into grooves, shaped like fingernails. The plastic smelled faintly of rust and ammonia. The surface was slick with a film that clung to their gloves when they tried to lift him away. And when they printed the file, the last page contained no words, only the faint outline of a hand pressed into the digital paper, as though someone had leaned across the draft itself. No one could say who had written it. The story had an ending, but not his. And in the quiet after, when the apartment was empty, the laptop woke again. The cursor blinked, steady, patient, waiting. Somewhere deep in the plastic, faint as a breath, came the sound of tapping, just one finger pressing a single key. Tap, pause, tap, waiting for someone else to finish the next draft. The unborn's hunger. The call came after midnight, as most unwelcome things do. Dr. Elena Reyes had been drifting in and out of shallow sleep on the narrow couch in her office when the hospital line buzzed. A flat, metallic tone that always carried bad news. She blinked at the ceiling for a long moment before fumbling for the receiver, her voice hoarse, a single word rasping out of her throat. Yes? The pathologist's assistant spoke in a clipped murmur, too calm for the hour. They had a case that needed her expertise. A woman, 32, 7 months pregnant, had been found dead 2 days ago. Cause of death uncertain. The autopsy was scheduled for the morning, but the lead examiner had made a strange request. Before proceeding, he wanted Elena to conduct an ultrasound to document the condition of the fetus. It wasn't protocol, not really, but he had insisted. Something about the belly seemed unsettled. Elena sat up slowly, her body aching with the stiffness of a day too long. She tried to remind herself that she had chosen this life, that she was no stranger to the cold rooms beneath the hospital, to the hush of metal tables and fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. Still, there was always that tug in her stomach, that cold reminder that death was never just science. There were other things too, things she tried to ignore. She washed her face in the sink, tied her hair back, and took the elevator down into the lower levels where the air thinned, where the corridors were tiled in a shade of pale green that never quite seemed clean no matter how much it was scrubbed. The morgue doors opened with a pneumatic sigh, releasing a draft of air colder than any air-conditioned ward upstairs. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and something underneath, metallic and raw, the kind of scent that clung to clothes long after you had left. The assistant was waiting for her, a thin man with a clipboard pressed too tightly to his chest. He said little, only guided her through the corridor into the examination suite. On the table lay the woman, covered in a white sheet. Her body looked smaller than it had in life, diminished, as though death had folded her in on herself. Only the swell of her abdomen stretched the cloth into a round dome, sharp in its stillness. Elena hesitated. She had performed countless ultrasounds on expectant mothers, guiding them through the joy of a heartbeat, the flicker of limbs on a screen, the sound of potential life carried through a transducer, but never like this, never on someone who would not wake again. She asked softly, almost to herself, "And you're certain this is necessary?" The assistant gave no answer beyond a nod. His eyes slid away, fixed on a corner of the room as though he too wanted no part of what was about to happen. She set down her bag and drew out the portable ultrasound unit, its monitor small and square, the buttons worn smooth from years of touch. She applied cold gel to the probe, the sound of it squeezing from the tube too loud in the still air. Her hands shook slightly as she drew the sheet back to reveal the pale skin of the abdomen, mottled faintly with lividity. The belly was taut, waxen, yet unmistakably full. She pressed the probe gently to the surface. The gel spread beneath it in a slick sheen. For a moment, nothing. Just the hum of the machine as it searched for signal, the screen filled with static waves. She adjusted the angle, moved slowly across the curve, listening to the hiss of the speakers. And then, all at once, it came. The sound, a steady thump, a strong beat, the unmistakable rhythm of a fetal heart. Elena froze, every muscle in her body locking at once. The speakers carried the sound clearly, unbroken, as though it came not from a corpse but from a living womb. Lub-dub, firm and insistent, echoing in the sterile air. Her hand trembled, the probe pressing harder against the cold flesh. The screen flickered, the image forming slowly into shapes, into shadows that shifted in recognizable patterns. There, within the darkness, a form moved. A small body curled in itself, limbs flexing. Not the still, silent silhouette she expected, but something that stretched, that writhed faintly, as if testing its confines. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her lips parting without sound. "This isn't possible," she whispered, though no one had asked. The assistant leaned closer, his expression drained of color. His lips worked, but no words came. The sound of the heartbeat filled the room, louder now, as though responding to her disbelief, quickening into a stronger rhythm. Elena adjusted the settings, desperate for an explanation, for some flaw in the equipment, a malfunction, interference, anything. Yet the image remained, stubborn, alive. Her mind raced. She recalled rare phenomena, muscle spasms after death, faint electrical activity persisting in tissues, but not this. Not a coherent, steady heartbeat days after the mother had died. Not the clear flutter of movement. Her breath fogged the screen as she leaned closer, her chest tightening with every passing second. The fetus shifted again, unmistakably. A hand, tiny and skeletal, stretched outward within the image. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw fingers press against the inside of the womb, pressing so firmly that the skin beneath her probe bulged ever so slightly, as though answering her touch. Elena pulled the probe back with a gasp. The gel smeared across her glove, the heartbeat vanishing into static. The silence that followed was crushing, a void that made her ears ring. She stared at the body on the table, at the belly rising like a pale hill beneath the sheet, unmoving. Still, the assistant whispered, almost inaudible, "Did you see?" She cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "No, we didn't see anything. The equipment is old. Interference, that's all." Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears, her denial brittle and unconvincing. Yet even as she spoke, the silence cracked, the speakers hissed, and then the sound returned, sudden and certain. The heartbeat, faster this time, stronger, filling the room with its rhythm. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Elena's hands clenched around the probe. Her pulse hammered in answer. She wanted to run, to shut down the machine, to slam the morgue door behind her, but she could not move. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, on the impossible shadow inside the dead, shifting as though aware of her, as though waiting for her to acknowledge it. Dr. Elena Reyes stood rigid, the probe still slick in her gloved hand, the hum of the ultrasound filling the morgue, with a sound that seemed to breathe on its own. The monitor glowed faintly, a storm of gray static drifting across its surface until, once more, the dark oval appeared. Within it, movement. A flutter that was too deliberate to be artifact, too regular to be dismissed as interference. She whispered to herself, almost pleading, "It's a machine error. It has to be." But the words hung in the air without conviction, drowned beneath the rhythm that pulsed from the speakers. The fetal heartbeat, strong and undeniable, filled the room with its cadence, not a stuttering echo, not random noise. A living rhythm, fast and sure, filling her chest until her own pulse stumbled in its attempt to keep pace. She turned to the assistant, but his face was pale. His lips pressed into a thin line as if he dared not breathe too loudly. His eyes flicked toward the body on the table, to the swollen curve of the belly, and then quickly away, as though the sight itself might draw something out. Elena forced her body to move, adjusting the probe with stiff fingers. She traced slowly across the arc of the abdomen, watching the grainy image shift on the screen. At first, it was just indistinct shapes, the cloudy blur of fluids, the shimmer of soft tissue. But then the outline sharpened. She saw the curl of a spine, the bulge of a skull, the faint shadows of arms and legs. They moved, not twitching randomly, not the way a fetus might stir during a normal scan, but restless, deliberate, as though something inside was pressing, pushing, searching for purchase. Her throat tightened as the shape of a hand formed clearly, 5 tiny digits stretching outward until they pressed against the inner wall. On the monitor, it looked like a high-contrast palm print, a ghostly hand pressed from the other side of the screen. At the same time, her probe lifted slightly as though the belly beneath had pushed back against her. The gel squelched faintly, slicked between her glove and the icy skin of the corpse. She yanked the probe away with a sharp breath. The image dissolved into static. The heartbeat stuttered and then surged louder, faster, more insistent, as though angered by her refusal. She stepped back from the table, one hand gripping the counter to steady herself. The assistant muttered finally, voice shaking, That isn't possible. The mother's been dead 2 days. No circulation, no oxygen. He cut himself off, the rest of his thought withering in his throat. Elena tried to gather words, medical terms, rational explanations, but each one fell apart before she could form them. There were rare cases of fetal survival after maternal death, she knew, but not after this long, not without intervention, not without blood. Yet here was a heartbeat, strong and demanding, echoing through speakers like a metronome set too fast. She tried to calm herself, moving to shut off the machine. Her finger hovered above the power button. Before she could press it, the monitor flashed violently, lines streaking across the screen like tearing film. For a split second, the static arranged itself into an image that made her breath catch. A face, not of the fetus, not blurred and half-formed, but something older, sharper, staring outward with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a soundless wail. Then it vanished, the fetus returning to the screen, curled and restless. The belly shifted visibly this time. Elena saw it. The skin rose in a small bulge beneath the sheet, moving from left to right in a jagged crawl. Her scalp prickled. Her every instinct screamed to step away, to leave. But she found herself rooted to the floor, her hand shaking above the control panel. Then the speakers cracked, not with the beat of a heart, but with something layered beneath it. A low rumble like static caught between stations. It rose, cracked again, and formed into something disturbingly close to a voice. The words were faint, broken, but clear enough to chill her marrow. "It's hungry." Elena's head jerked toward the assistant, but his mouth was clamped shut, his eyes wide. The sound had not come from him. It had come from the machine, from the speakers, from inside the womb. She stumbled back, her hip striking a tray, sending metal instruments rattling across the tiles. The clatter was loud, too loud in the morgue, echoing until it seemed to come from every corner. The body on the table lay still again, the belly smooth, the skin pale and taut beneath the harsh lights, but the monitor continued to show movement, the fetus twisting and writhing as though impatient. Her hands shook so badly the probe slipped from her grip, clattering against the floor. Gel smeared across her gloves, sticky and cold. She whispered, "No, this isn't," but she could not finish the sentence. The heartbeat pounded louder, now resonating through the metal table itself, a vibration that climbed into her bones. She forced herself toward the machine, reaching again for the power button. The screen flickered violently, light searing her eyes, and then words formed, jagged white against the storm of static. Not typed, not digital, as though scrawled by a trembling hand across the inside of the screen itself. It needs warmth. Her breath caught. A sob lodged in her throat. She slammed her palm against the power button, and the machine went dark. The heartbeat cut off instantly, leaving the morgue in a suffocating silence. She stood trembling, every nerve raw, staring at the corpse. The sheet shifted faintly as the air conditioner cycled on, and her chest seized as though the body itself had stirred. She knew it hadn't, told herself it hadn't, but her legs carried her back until her spine pressed against the door, her lungs dragging in shallow gulps of icy air. The assistant finally spoke again, his voice thin and brittle. What do we write in the report?" Elena stared at him with wide, hollow eyes, her voice cracking as she answered. "Nothing. We write nothing. This didn't happen." But even as she said it, the silence broke. From somewhere deep within the corpse, faint but certain, came a new sound. Not a heartbeat this time. A soft scrape, a faint tearing, as though something inside had discovered that hunger could not wait forever. The sound was faint at first, so faint that Elena almost convinced herself it was the hiss of the air vents or the faint hum of the refrigeration units that kept the morgue cool. But no, she had lived with those noises long enough to know their rhythm. This was different. This was jagged, irregular, a damp scrape followed by silence, then another, as if something inside the body on the table was dragging itself against the walls of its confinement. She pressed her back harder against the cold door, her breath quickening, her eyes fixed on the sheet that rose over the corpse's swollen belly. The assistant stood frozen, his clipboard slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. Neither of them bent to pick it up. Neither of them dared move. The silence returned for a heartbeat, heavy, suffocating, and then the belly shifted. Not a twitch, not the faint settling of gases or muscle spasms she had sometimes seen in cadavers. This was deliberate. The bulge pushed upward, sharp and unnatural, traveling slowly beneath the skin until it reached the center of the dome. The fabric of the sheet strained, stretching, before sinking back as though the thing inside had withdrawn again. The assistant whispered hoarsely, "It's moving." Elena swallowed hard, her mouth dry, her heart thudding so hard she thought the machine might still be on, still broadcasting it through her chest. "It can't be," she said, but her voice trembled. Her body knew it could be. Her body had already accepted what her mind refused. The belly shifted again, this time with greater force, rocking the sheet. A low sound followed, wet and fibrous, like fabric tearing but deeper, fleshier. The assistant gagged, covering his mouth with his hand. Elena felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself upright, her gaze locked on the corpse. The woman's eyelids fluttered. It was only for a second, a brief shiver across pale skin, but Elena saw it. The assistant saw it. They stared in horror as the lids trembled again, then opened, revealing eyes clouded with death yet faintly gleaming, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The lips parted slightly, dry and cracked, and from them issued a whisper so faint Elena thought at first it was the air vents again. "It's hungry." Her stomach clenched. Her hands shook so badly she pressed them against her chest to steady them. She forced herself to speak, to demand an answer, though she knew none would come. "What does it want?" The corpse's lips moved once more. "Something warm." The assistant staggered backward, nearly falling into a tray of instruments. Elena could not look away. The belly surged again, a violent motion now, the skin stretching grotesquely, pushing outward as if fists were pounding from within. The sound of tearing grew louder, fibers splitting, tissue straining against an impossible pressure. And then, abruptly, the sheet split. A thin red line opened across the corpse's abdomen, shallow at first, then deepening, spreading outward with a deliberate slowness, as though invisible hands were pulling it apart from the inside. No blood-spilled death had dried the veins, but the flesh itself yielded with a sickening softness, the edges dark and glistening. Elena gasped, clamping a hand over her mouth. Her mind screamed to flee, to push through the door behind her and never return. But her legs betrayed her, holding her rooted to the floor. The assistant let out a strangled cry, his voice rising high and thin as the first small shape emerged from the tier. It was a finger, tiny, pale, no longer the delicate pink of new life, but gray and slick, mottled with a waxy sheen. It curled upward, trembling, before scraping against the air as though grasping for something unseen. Another finger followed, then a hand, impossibly small yet disturbingly strong. The nails darkened, almost claw-like. It clenched once, then opened, feeling the air, reaching, hungering. Elena could not breathe. She pressed herself against the door, every nerve in her body screaming, but she could not move. She watched as the hand withdrew slightly, then pushed again, widening the tear until the sound of rending flesh filled the room. The corpse's head rolled to one side, its mouth slack. From deep within, a noise emerged, not a heartbeat now, but a wet, rhythmic sound, like chewing. The speakers of the machine, though powered off, crackled once, emitting a distorted echo of the noise, as though the hunger itself was strong enough to bleed into the circuitry. The assistant dropped to his knees, sobbing, whispering prayers under his breath. Elena's mind spun with frantic thoughts, half medical, half irrational. She thought of parasitic twins, of muscle contractions, of the body releasing stored gases. She thought of ancient myths, of unborn spirits feeding on the living. Nothing made sense. Everything made sense. The tiny hand pressed farther out, curling around the edge of the torn skin as if pulling itself forward. Its nails raked against the sheet, leaving faint dark streaks across the fabric. For one surreal moment, Elena thought of infants she had delivered in bright, sterile rooms upstairs, how their first movements were reaching for the world, for touch, for warmth. This was the same, but horribly inverted, seeking not embrace but sustenance. The corpse's lips moved again, the voice rougher now, as though borrowed from some deeper place. It's hungry. It needs more. Elena's knees nearly buckled. She pressed her hands against the cold door to steady herself, her breath fogging in the chilled air. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but another part of her, the part trained to observe, to document, kept her eyes locked on the scene. She whispered, barely audible, "Dear God." The hand withdrew again, disappearing into the gash. The belly convulsed, rolling in unnatural waves, the skin rippling as though something inside was pacing, turning, deciding. The sound of chewing grew louder, wet and deliberate, until it filled the morgue like a second heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly, silence. The body lay still, the belly flat once more beneath the torn sheet. The wound closed into a dark, gaping line. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the hunger had only retreated for now. Elena and the assistant stood frozen, waiting, their breath shallow, until the silence itself felt like the worst sound of all. The silence after the tearing was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the air itself had stopped moving. Doctor, Elena Reyes stood with her back pressed so firmly against the morgue door that the metal left a chill along her spine. The assistant was still crouched near the counter, one hand gripping the leg of a stool as if the solid metal could anchor him. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them wanted to disturb the fragile pause that had settled over the room. The belly of the corpse no longer rose like a dome. It lay strangely slack now, deflated beneath the torn sheet, though the wound that had been forced open still gaped slightly, the edges puckered and dark, glistening faintly in the fluorescent light. The hand that had reached outward, that impossible tiny hand, had vanished back inside, leaving only the memory of its movement burned into their eyes. Elena's breath came in shallow bursts. She tried to think like a physician, to grasp some rational explanation, but her mind kept circling back to the sound, that wet chewing noise, low and steady, reverberating inside her skull long after it had stopped. She thought of parasites, of bizarre case studies buried in obscure journals, of fetuses that clung to life a few minutes beyond the death of the mother. But 2 days, 2 nights of cooling tissue, and still movement, voice, hunger. No science could hold it. The assistant broke the stillness with a whisper. We should leave." Elena opened her mouth to agree, but the moment the words formed, another sound cut through the room. A heartbeat. It began faint, like the echo of memory, then swelled stronger, faster, pounding through the speakers of the dormant ultrasound machine, though its power light was dark. Lub-dub, lub-dub, insistent, furious. The probe still lay on the floor, slick with gel, but the sound came anyway, as though the room itself was wired into the child's pulse. Elena shook her head, murmuring, No, this isn't happening." but her denial was swallowed whole by what followed. The belly moved again. Not a twitch this time, not a roll, but a violent lurch that arched the corpse's back against the table. The sheet slid away, bearing pale skin marred by a jagged tear that now widened with each convulsion. The sound of splitting flesh returned, louder, wetter, fibers snapping in uneven bursts. The assistant cried out, stumbling backward until his shoulders struck the wall. Elena's hands pressed against the door behind her, every instinct screaming at her to escape, but her eyes refused to look away. She watched as the tear widened, stretching grotesquely, until the skin seemed ready to peel apart completely. A hand burst through, not tentative this time, not fragile. It thrust outward with sudden force. The tiny fingers curled into claws that raked against the metal tray beside the table. The sound of scraping nails on steel echoed sharply, setting her teeth on edge. The hand was stronger now, the skin darker, mottled gray-blue, the veins visible beneath its surface. It gripped the tray and bent it slightly, impossibly strong for something so small. Then another hand appeared, pushing the wound wider. The belly split further, and the torso of the corpse shifted grotesquely as if the ribs themselves were cracking from inside. The corpse's mouth opened in a silent scream, her clouded eyes fixed on the ceiling as her body served only as a shell, a doorway for the thing that writhed within. The voice returned, rasping through the corpse's lips, though no breath passed between them. "It needs more," the assistant gagged, one hand pressed to his mouth as he stumbled toward the door. He grabbed the handle, rattled it violently, but it would not budge. Elena could feel the vibration of his struggle against her back, but the lock held firm, as though the morgue had decided no one would leave until the hunger had been fed. Her heart pounded in her throat as she turned back to the table. The sheet had slipped entirely away now. The belly was torn wide, and through the ragged opening she saw not only hands but the crown of a head pressing outward. Skin stretched thin, slick and glistening. The movements were violent, desperate. Not the gentle motions of birth, but the thrashing of something ravenous forcing its way free. The speakers crackled again, carrying a sound that was not just heartbeat now, but a layered cacophony. Beneath the pulse was a faint gnawing noise, the crunch of something wet between teeth that had not yet formed. Elena's stomach turned. She clamped a hand to her chest, her nails digging through her lab coat into her skin, grounding herself against the impossible scene. The corpse jerked once more, and with a wet, tearing crack, the wound split wide. The assistant screamed, stumbling backward, but Elena only stood frozen as the small form inside lurched halfway into the world. Its hands slapped wetly against the table, its arms trembling, its head bowed. What little hair clung to its skull was damp, plastered in streaks across mottled skin. Its back rose and fell as it shuddered, though no lungs should have drawn breath. Then it lifted its head. Its eyes were not newborn eyes. They were wide, dark, gleaming with hunger older than any infant should know. Its mouth opened, jaw trembling as though still learning the motion, and from it came not a cry but a sound low and guttural, the sound of something demanding. The corpse beneath it spoke again, the voice rasping through cracked lips. "It needs warmth. It needs flesh." Elena's hand flew to the crucifix that hung beneath her shirt, a reflex from childhood, though she had long abandoned the faith. Her lips trembled against words she could not form. She wanted to run, to pound the door, to scream, but her voice had abandoned her. All she could do was stare as the thing writhed, dragging itself farther out, the ragged edges of its mother's belly stretching to accommodate the hunger that would not be denied. The assistant's cries grew louder as he slammed against the door, each impact echoing uselessly. The fetus, if it could still be called, that turned its head at the sound, its neck cracking audibly as it tilted, listening. Then it reached out with one trembling hand, nails scraping across the metal of the table, leaving trails of yellowish fluid that hissed faintly as it touched the surface. The sound of chewing returned, not from its mouth, but from the speakers, amplified, multiplied, filling the morgue with the sensation of teeth gnashing through air itself. And then silence again. The thing froze, halfway born, its head lifted, its mouth parted in expectation. The corpse's voice spoke one last time, low and broken. "Feed it, or it will feed itself." The words hung in the sterile air as the heartbeat pounded faster, harder, demanding, insistent, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble in rhythm. The morgue had no windows, only the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the metallic chill of air that never changed. But Dr. Elena Reyes felt as though the room itself had shrunk, pressing her inward until there was nothing left except her and the thing that had forced itself halfway into the world. The corpse lay slack beneath it, pale and emptied, as though the body were no more than a shell stretched around the wound. The child, or what resembled one, balanced its hands on the edge of the table, trembling, its limbs jerky, its skin pallid and veined. Where she expected weakness, there was a stubborn strength, muscles flexing as it dragged itself further, the torn flesh widening with each twitch. The assistant pounded at the locked door behind her, his fists raw, his voice hoarse from crying. "Please, God, someone open it, please." But his words had no weight here. They dissolved into the air like mist, ignored by whatever force held the lock tight. Elena had given up on the door. Her mind was fixed on the table, on the slow inevitability of the emergence. The sound of the heartbeat grew so loud it seemed to fill her chest, a rhythm that was not her own. Between the pounding beats, another sound threaded through, a soft, wet gnash, as though teeth were grinding against flesh that was not there. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the noise was inside her head now, vibrating against her skull. The thing lifted its face. Its eyes met hers, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. They were not the blurred, unfocused eyes of a newborn. They were sharp, knowing, unblinking. They held her there, pinned like an insect, as if it had already chosen her. Its mouth opened wider, a string of saliva or fluid trailing down its chin, and from its throat came a sound she could not bear to call a cry. It was hunger given voice, raw and insistent. The corpse's lips moved once more, barely audible, rasping through cracked skin. "It needs warmth. It needs flesh." The words were flat now, emptied of emotion, a message delivered by a vessel that had nothing left to give. The assistant screamed behind her, the frantic pounding of his fists turning into dull thuds as exhaustion overtook him. Elena wanted to scream too, to beg for release, but her body betrayed her. Her feet carried her forward, one trembling step at a time, until she stood close enough to smell the thing, an acrid tang, like iron and something sour, like meat left too long in the sundae. The child reached toward her. Its hand was small, impossibly so, but the fingers stretched longer than they should have, tipped with nails dark and curved. They brushed the air, searching, trembling. She flinched backward, pressing her spine into the cold wall, but she could not retreat far enough. Her mind fractured, one part screaming to flee, another whispering the truth she could no longer deny. This was not an error, not a hallucination born of fatigue. This was life clinging where it should not exist, a hunger that had been trapped in darkness too long, now demanding to be fed. She whispered, her voice cracked. "What do you want from me?" The heartbeat answered, pounding faster, and the mouth of the corpse moved one last time. "You, Elena Steiger Hekniesbockling." Her hands clutched at the crucifix beneath her shirt, metal biting into her palm. Her gaze darted to the assistant, but he was useless, collapsed against the locked door, sobbing into his hands. No help would come. No one else even knew she was here. The thing heaved itself higher, shoulders emerging, the wound tearing with a sound that made bile rise in her throat. The table shook beneath its effort. Its mouth opened again, and for the first time a faint sound emerged, a sucking, wheezing noise, like air forced through a throat that had never learned how to breathe. Elena's eyes darted to the instruments scattered across the counter. Scalpels, forceps, metal glinting beneath the lights. For a split second she imagined seizing one, ending this before it fully began. But as soon as the thought formed, the thing's eyes locked onto hers again, and she knew she could not. She was already chosen. She was already written into its hunger. The air thickened, every breath heavier than the last. She stepped forward without meaning to, her arms trembling as if guided by something beyond her. The child's hand found hers. Its skin was cold, slick, but the grip was shockingly strong. Tiny fingers curled around her gloved palm and held tight. The speakers crackled one final time, static breaking through the morgue until words bled into the air, not spoken but pressed into sound itself. Warmth. Now, the assistant screamed her name, but it was too far away, muffled, drowned beneath the pounding in her ears. She felt the nails pressing through her glove, piercing skin, a sharp sting followed by the warmth of her own blood spreading across her palm. The thing shuddered, its body convulsing as though feeding on the smallest taste. The wound in its mother widened, and with one last heave it tore itself free, sliding wetly onto the metal table. Elena stumbled back, but the grip on her hand did not loosen. The creature pulled itself upright with unnatural strength, its eyes never leaving hers, its mouth opening wider in anticipation. The smell of iron filled the room. The speakers wailed with the sound of its heartbeat, faster now, frenzied, ravenous. She tried to pull away, but the corpse's body shifted, its head rolling to the side, its jaw dropping open wider than before. From its throat came a whisper so sharp it cut the silence in two. "Do not run. Feed it." The assistant collapsed fully, curling into himself, refusing to look. Elena's body shook as she stared at the creature that clung to her, its mouth inches from her skin. She knew, with a certainty that rooted itself in the deepest part of her, that no matter what she did, it would feed. Her choice was not whether it would happen. Her choice was how. The lights above flickered, casting the room in brief flashes of shadow, and in each flicker she thought she saw the small figure not as an infant, but as something older, something lean and sharp, with a mouth that stretched too wide and eyes that gleamed with the memory of every meal it had ever been denied. Her voice broke as she whispered, "God help me." But no help came. The last sound she heard before darkness took her was the gnash of teeth closing over flesh, the triumphant rush of a heartbeat that was not her own, and the ragged voice of a mother long dead sighing in relief as though at last her child had been fed. When the morgue staff arrived the following morning, they found the room sealed, the equipment fried as though struck by a surge of power. The assistant sat catatonic near the door, his nails torn bloody from clawing at the lock. Dr. Elena Reyes was nowhere to be found. On the table lay the corpse of the woman, her abdomen torn and hollowed, the skin pale and slack. There was no fetus inside, no remains at all, only a dark smear across the floor that led to the far corner, vanishing into shadow. The ultrasound machine powered itself on one last time when they moved the body. The speakers crackled, and through the static came the faintest sound of a heartbeat, fast, hungry, and very much alive. The call for silence. The hour between midnight and dawn always had a particular stillness about it, a kind of silence that was deeper than anything Jack ever heard during the day. It wasn't the quiet of a library or a church, filled with suppressed whispers and the shuffle of bodies. It was heavier, more complete, as though the whole world had been put on pause. Sitting alone in the call center, Jack had come to know that silence too well. The building was nearly empty after dark. A handful of night shift workers occupied the far side of the floor, their desks lit by the dim hum of computer screens, but their voices never carried across the vast expanse. The overhead lights had been turned down to half power, casting the room in a pale, tired glow. A few tubes flickered at odd intervals, their sputtering buzz filling the gaps between Jack's breaths. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing at his eyes. The headset itched against his scalp, the padded earpieces pressing just a little too firmly after hours of wear. His desk smelled faintly of cheap coffee and disinfectant wipes, a cocktail of fatigue and routine. A digital clock on the wall ticked away the minutes. 2:58, 2:59. Jack had been working this job long enough to understand its rhythms. During the day, the calls never stopped, overlapping, stacking one on top of another. At night, though, they came in waves. Long stretches of emptiness, of static-filled silence and the hum of machines, broken by sudden bursts of panic, a car crash on a rural road, an old man's chest seizing while no one else was around, a child choking in a darkened kitchen. He was prepared for those moments. He was trained for them. But it was in the in-between, the yawning stretches of nothing, that the weight pressed down. When the calls weren't coming, it was just Jack, the phone, and the empty space. He sipped from his mug, grimacing at the cold dregs of coffee, and tapped his fingers on the desk in time with the whine of the air conditioning unit above him. His eyelids grew heavy. He told himself he'd splash his face in the restroom at 3, just to stay sharp. That was when the phone rang. The sound wasn't startling, it was what he was there for. After all, but in the quiet of that moment it cut through the air like a knife, shrill and metallic. Jack straightened, his chair creaking, and pressed the blinking button on his console. "Emergency services," he said, voice steady from habit though his throat was dry. For a moment, there was only static, a low, Uneven hiss, like wind pressing against a microphone. He waited, adjusting the volume dial with a practiced hand. "This is emergency dispatch," he repeated. "Can you hear me?" The static grew louder, ebbing and flowing as though the line itself was breathing. He thought he caught the shape of something beneath it, faint, muffled, but it was gone before he could place it. He leaned forward, the headset warm against his ears. "Hello?" he asked again. "If you're in trouble, I need you to stay calm and say something. Any word at all." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the line. Then, faintly, a sound emerged. It wasn't words. It was a low, guttural noise, ragged and wet, like the groan of someone whose lungs were full of water. Jack frowned, his pen hovering above the notepad on his desk. His training told him to catalog everything, no matter how small. "Sir? Ma'am?" He tried gently. "I can hear you, but you need to speak up." The noise came again, longer this time, dragging across his ears like a sigh that had been caught in a throat too tight. It wasn't the sound of someone crying, not exactly, but it carried the weight of pain, of something unspoken trying to claw its way free. Jack's skin prickled beneath his shirt. He glanced toward the far side of the floor, half expecting one of his colleagues to look up, to catch his eye, to acknowledge that they too heard something strange. But no, everyone else was buried in their own screens, their own silence. It was just him and the line. "Listen," Jack said, his voice firmer now. "If you're hurt, I need you to tell me where you are. We can send help, but only if you give me something to go on." For a long stretch, there was only the hiss of static again. Jack wrote down the time, tapping his pen against the pad. Then the line shifted. A voice, so faint he almost didn't hear it. "I can't." Jack sat bolt upright, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. The voice was old, cracked, barely there, like someone trying to force sound from a throat that had forgotten how. He swallowed hard, pressing his pen to the paper. "Can't what?" he asked carefully. The voice came again, a rasp that carried more pain than volume. "I can't speak. They cut my tongue. They want me silent." Jack's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth, shut it again, forced himself to stay professional. "Sir, I need to know your location. Do you understand? If you can't speak clearly, make a sound. Anything. Just help me help you." "Oh." The line filled with static, and beneath it, a faint choking noise, the sound of someone trying to swallow against a throat that would not cooperate. Jack's chest tightened. He leaned closer, the headset pressing into his ear. The voice returned, faint and broken. "Please, call for me. I can't. They won't let me." Jack's hand shook, his pen scratching nonsense on the page. His heart beat harder than it should have, his training slipping into the background as something colder and older pressed into his mind. There was no address, no number on his screen, just a call routed from nowhere, arriving at his desk at 3 a.m, carrying a voice that should not exist. The line crackled, then stilled, leaving only silence. Jack pulled the headset from his ears, his breath ragged, staring at the phone as though it might ring again. His reflection shimmered faintly in the dark plastic of the console, pale and wide-eyed. The clock on the wall clicked over. 3 o'clock. Exactly. The phone sat silent. For now, the silence after the first call ended was worse than the static had been. Jack sat rigid in his chair, the headset still clamped to one ear, his hand frozen on the notepad where his pen had scrawled nothing but scratches. He had answered hundreds of calls over the last year, some desperate, some incoherent, some that ended in screams or nothing at all. But this felt different. This had weight. It pressed against him the way silence sometimes presses in a dark bedroom, where the air seems thicker, more aware, as though something unseen is holding its breath. He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him, and rubbed his face with both hands. He told himself it was fatigue, the long hours playing tricks on his senses, maybe even a dream he had slipped into with his eyes open. He would log the call, note it as unintelligible, and move on. That was procedure. But even as he reached for the keyboard, his ears strained, waiting for the phone to ring again. His body expected it, dreaded it, long before the console lights began to flicker. The ring tore through the room, shrill and insistent, pulling him upright before he realized he had moved. His finger hovered over the accept button. He glanced toward the far end of the office. but the others were still hunched over their screens, oblivious, sealed in their own bubbles of half-sleep. The phone rang again, and again. The sound crawled under his skin. Jack pressed the button. Emergency services. What's your emergency? The headset filled instantly with sound, but it wasn't a voice. It was a wet, labored swallow, drawn out until it scraped against his eardrum. He winced, clutching the earpiece tighter to his head as though that could make sense of the noise. "Hello?" he asked. His voice cracked against his training. "Can you hear me? I need you to say something." The swallowing came again, louder this time, almost exaggerated, like the microphone had been pressed directly to the throat of the caller. The sound was thick, sticky, followed by a faint wheeze. It carried with it the intimate unpleasantness of something too close, as though someone were leaning directly against his ear. Jack's pulse climbed. His fingers trembled against the notepad. He told himself to remain calm, to follow procedure, to ask the caller for information, but the words stuck in his mouth. He swallowed hard, mimicking the sound he heard, and whispered, "Where are you?" No response. Only another gulp, heavier, strained, as though forcing down something that didn't belong in a human throat. Jack's eyes drifted to the screen above his console. Normally, the incoming number would display there, even if scrambled or withheld. This one showed nothing. Just a blank strip of black, no digits, no trace. He licked his lips, heart hammering. "I can't help you unless you speak. Tap the phone. Make a noise. Anything." As if in answer, the headset hissed. Then came a new sound, sharp, thin, metallic. A scrape, drawn across the microphone like a blade dragged over steel. It shrieked in his ear, forcing him to pull the headset away. The noise went on, a jagged rhythm, pausing only to resume in uneven bursts, like someone carving a message into the very air. Jack slammed the volume down, his breath ragged, eyes darting around the room. Nobody else reacted. No one had heard it. He was alone with it. The scraping slowed, then stopped. Silence filled the headset, except for a faint, ragged exhale, the suggestion of someone still on the other end, waiting. Jack lowered the headset back to his ear, cautiously, almost against his will. "Who are you?" he whispered. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then, beneath the hiss of the line, came the faintest sound of movement. Not a word, not even a groan, just the sound of lips smacking together, tongue or the absence of one pressing against empty gums, a mouth forming shapes that could no longer be spoken. Jack's skin went cold. His stomach twisted. He could almost imagine the caller, an old man hunched in some forgotten room, jaw working uselessly, voice stolen, trying to push meaning through the mutilation. He wanted to hang up. Every instinct told him to cut the line, to tear the headset off, but his hands refused. He was anchored there, caught in the grotesque intimacy of listening. The scraping returned, softer now, intermittent. A few short scratches followed by silence, then one long, deliberate drag. Jack closed his eyes, sweat dampening his temples. He could hear it not just in his ear but in his teeth, vibrating down his jaw. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused, drifting down to the phone itself. The console sat silent, its plastic casing dull in the dim light. But as he stared, he noticed something strange. The speaker grill beneath the handset was dark, darker than it should have been, a shadow pooling in the grooves, almost wet. Jack leaned forward, lips parting, breath shallow. He blinked, convinced he was imagining it, fatigue painting shapes that weren't there. But then a drop formed, swollen, round, clinging to the edge of the grill. It fell. The droplet landed on the desk with a soft pat, leaving a smear of brown-red behind. Jack jerked back, his chair rolling an inch. His gaze snapped between the phone and the headset, his ears still filled with the sound of swallowing, of scratching metal, of something breathing where no one should be. Another drop formed, and another. They slid from the speaker in uneven intervals, trailing down the casing, staining the pale surface of his desk. The smell hit him then, sharp and metallic. The smell of iron left too long in the air. Jack's breath caught. His hand hovered over the console, trembling, desperate to end the call. But even through the static, through the choking, through the impossible seep of liquid from a machine that was never meant to bleed, he knew one thing: the caller wasn't finished. He pulled the headset away again, staring at it as if it were a weapon pressed against his head. The line remained open, steady, patient. Somewhere, on the other side, something waited. The digital clock on the wall ticked over to 3:10, and the phone rang again. The third ring came before Jack had time to breathe. It was impossible, the line was already open, his headset still hissing with the wet static of the last call. Yet the console lights blinked again, urgent, shrill, as if another call had slipped into the same channel. The sound wasn't distant this time. It was sharp, immediate, almost inside his skull. Jack's fingers hovered over the button. His throat was dry, words caught before they could form. He knew, deep down, that he should disconnect the line entirely, pull the power, even rip the headset from its cord if he had to. But the thought of letting the call go unanswered chilled him more than the thought of answering. There was something binding about it now, as though he had been chosen, and not picking up would invite something worse than hearing the voice again. He pressed the button. The hiss swallowed him instantly. A deep, uneven static filled the headset, loud enough to make him flinch, then tapered down to a softer crackle, like fire burning low in wet wood. He forced himself to breathe evenly. "Emergency services," he whispered, though his voice was a ghost of its usual tone. "What's your emergency?" The line didn't respond with words. It responded with presence. There was a sound so faint, he thought it might be the blood rushing in his ears, that resolved into slow, deliberate breaths. Not calm, not rhythmic, but forced, as if dragged through a ruined throat. Each inhale rattled. Each exhale was a gurgle, thick and close. Jack leaned forward against his will, as though the headset drew him nearer to hear better. "Sir? Ma'am?" His voice trembled. "If you can't speak, tap twice for yes, once for no." The silence stretched. Then, with agonizing slowness, came a faint click. Not from the headset, not from a mouth. It was sharper, like something hard striking metal. Once. Pause. Twice. Jack froze, pen dangling above his pad. The caller had heard him. "Okay," he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard by something more than the caller. "Can you tell me if you're in danger?" 2 taps for yes. 2 taps followed. Slow. Certain. His skin prickled. He scribbled down the response, but the paper swam beneath his eyes. "Where are you?" he asked, louder this time. "Give me anything. A landmark, an address, a name." No taps came. Instead, the swallowing sound returned, wet and deliberate. Jack closed his eyes, bile rising in his throat. It was as if the caller were drinking him in, pulling his voice through the line and swallowing it whole. Then something new. A whisper not through the line but behind him. He spun in his chair. The office stretched out into rows of dark cubicles, their monitors glowing faintly. No one stood there. No one moved. Yet he swore he had heard it. A wordless murmur, breathed against his ear from only inches away. Jack's heart slammed. He whipped the headset off, staring at it as though it had sprouted teeth. The console still blinked. The line still hissed. But the whisper, had that been in his ear? Or inside the phone? He pushed the earpiece back, hands trembling. That was when the sound shifted. It was no longer confined to the headset. It leaked. He could hear it in the room now. Faint but unmistakable. A wet scraping, the sound of something dragging metal against metal. He looked at the phone. The speaker grill was oozing again, droplets welling up and sliding down its sides. One fell onto his notepad, blooming into the paper like a spreading bruise. His breath came fast. "What do you want from me?" This time the voice answered, not the broken whisper from before, but a low, ragged growl that seemed to vibrate in the very wires. Silence. Jack's hands shook violently. "Why me?" he whispered. The voice rasped through static, a wet and ruined sound. "Because you answered." "M." The words hit him like ice. He staggered back in his chair, headset slipping down around his neck, the mouthpiece thudding softly against his collarbone. He wanted to run, to leave the console buzzing in the dark, but his body would not obey. His eyes fixed on the phone, on the slow spread of brown-red liquid dripping steadily now, forming a small pool on the desk. The breathing on the line grew heavier, the swallowing deeper, louder, filling not just his ears but the room itself. Jack's gaze darted to the fluorescent lights overhead, and in their flicker he thought he saw the shadows of wires swaying, as though the building itself were breathing with the call. He couldn't move. He couldn't blink. The line was alive, and it was holding him in place. "Stay," the voice croaked, cracking mid-word. "Stay quiet. Stay with me." The headset crackled, then cut to silence. Not the kind of silence Jack knew from before, the heavy absence of sound. This was worse. This was waiting. Jack sat motionless in his chair, the phone dripping in steady intervals onto his notes, the clock ticking on the wall. 3:17, 3:18. The console light blinked again, and again, and again. The phone never stopped ringing. Jack's hand hovered over the console like it no longer belonged to him. The phone was ringing, over and over, the red light blinking so furiously that it seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heart. The hiss in his headset had grown quieter, but not gone. It was waiting. He knew that. The phone wasn't calling out, it was breathing in, drawing him closer. The pool of liquid on his desk had widened. It wasn't bright red. Under the fluorescent lights it looked darker, thicker, like rust pulled fresh from old pipes. The smell filled his nose, metallic and sour, crawling into the back of his throat until he could taste it. He wanted to gag, but even that felt dangerous, as though making a sound would mark him. He leaned back in his chair, the headset sliding slightly down his neck. The mouthpiece rested just above his collarbone, and as he sat there, frozen, he felt something brush against it. A vibration. Soft at first, then sharper, like someone exhaling directly into the microphone. His pulse stuttered. The console wasn't just ringing anymore. It was answering itself. Jack reached forward, trembling, and pulled the headset fully off. He dropped it onto the desk where it landed, with a dull thud, its cord twisting like a snake. But the sound didn't stop. The labored breathing continued, not muffled by the plastic but clear, raw, filling the space between him and the phone. Each inhale rattled with fluid. Each exhale gurgled, bubbling faintly. His chair creaked as he pushed back, desperate for distance. The desk looked wrong now. The phone was no longer just an object. Its casing seemed darker, slick in the dim glow, as though absorbing the ooze seeping from its seams. The red light blinked slower now, a steady throb. Jack whispered without meaning to, the word escaping like a prayer. "Stop." The phone obeyed. The light went out. The ringing ceased. The room fell still. For a heartbeat, he thought he had broken it. Relief spilled into his chest, his shoulders sagging. He laughed once, brittle. The sound cracked and too loud in the silence. That was when the phone spoke. Not a ring, not static. A voice, low and cracked, crawling from the speaker grill like breath forced through broken glass. Too loud. Jack's laugh died in his throat. His mouth went dry. The voice came again, clearer now, rising from deep within the line. "You must be silent. With me." He shook his head, whispering back, as if whispering could undo what he had done. "No. No, this isn't real." The speaker hissed. A wet, rasping chuckle bled into the air. "You answered. You heard. You can't unhear." Jack shoved his chair back so hard it toppled. He stumbled to his feet, chest heaving. His eyes darted to the other workers across the floor, but their cubicles remained dark and still. They didn't hear it. They didn't see the liquid spreading across his desk, dripping down onto the floor in thick ropes. He staggered backward. His shoe slipped on the wet patch beneath him, and for one horrifying instant he imagined his foot sliding through not liquid, but flesh. He stumbled again, caught himself against a partition. The phone was still speaking. "Silence is safe," it croaked. "Silence is home. Join me." Jack clapped his hands over his ears. The sound didn't dim. It pressed inside him now, beneath his skin, a resonance that vibrated his bones. The voice wasn't just in the phone anymore, it was inside his chest cavity, crawling up his throat, tickling the edges of his tongue. He opened his mouth to scream, to purge the sensation, but no sound came. His voice caught, trapped. His lungs burned with the effort. The phone chuckled again. "Better. Quieter. Stay that way." Jack clawed at his throat, panic flooding him. His vocal cords strained but refused to obey. Every attempt at speech died before it began, like air was being stolen the moment it rose. His own silence suffocated him. The console light blinked again, not red this time but sickly yellow. The ring returned, though muted, muffled, like a heartbeat echoing from underwater. He turned to run, but the line caught him in place. His feet refused to move, anchored by dread. The liquid reached the edge of his desk, dripping steadily onto the carpet. He looked down and saw not stains, but shapes. Letters, formed from the spreading ooze, smeared as though written by a tongue pressed flat against the floor. Silence. The words stared up at him, jagged and wet. His chest convulsed. His vision swam. He forced himself to look away, to fix his eyes on the phone again. The speaker pulsed with each breath, each word. They cut mine. Yours next. Jack's knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor, hands trembling against the cold linoleum. His headset dangled from the desk above, swaying slightly. From its mouthpiece came a new sound, a wet rasp. Closer, as though someone had pressed their ruined lips against it. The voice whispered one last time, almost tender. Don't speak. Don't breathe. Don't leave me alone. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then dimmed to nothing. Jack sat in darkness, the only glow the faint yellow pulse of the console. The sound of wet swallowing filled the room, louder than his own heartbeat. And still, he could not scream. Jack could no longer tell how long he had been sitting in the dark. Time had become untethered, slipping through his hands like water, each second stretched and distorted by the steady pulse of the console light. Yellow. Off. Yellow. Off. Each flicker was a heartbeat, but not his own. His own heart felt sluggish, irregular, as though it had given up its rhythm to the phone. The voice no longer spoke aloud. It didn't need to. It lived in the silence now, woven into every corner of the room. Jack heard it in the scrape of his chair legs, in the rattle of the air conditioner, even in the hum of the fluorescent bulbs. Every noise carried the faint edge of breath, a whisper folded into sound. He hadn't tried to speak in what felt like hours. The last attempt had burned his throat raw, his voice swallowed before it could escape. He had resigned himself to silence. Every instinct warned him that if he tried again, if he dared to make a sound, the thing on the line would finish what it had promised and take his tongue too. The liquid had spread further. It pooled around the legs of his desk, dark and sticky, smelling stronger now. Iron and rot, copper and smoke. His shoes were soaked. When he shifted his feet, they peeled from the floor with a soft, wet pop. He wanted to vomit, but even that reflex seemed denied to him. His body held hostage by the unseen will of the call. The headset still swayed where it had fallen, the mouthpiece brushing against the edge of the desk. Jack stared at it until his vision blurred. Every now and then it twitched, not with the motion of air conditioning or his own clumsy nudges, but as though someone on the other end tugged gently at the cord, reminding him that the line was still open. He pressed his palms to his ears, desperate to block it all out. But silence no longer belonged to him. The silence belonged to the caller, and it was hungry. A faint vibration rattled through the desk. Jack lowered his hands slowly, eyes darting toward the console. The light no longer blinked. It was steady now, glowing sickly yellow without pause. Then the speaker crackled, not with static, but with a sound so mundane it turned his stomach. The ring of another phone. Not his console. Not the landline. The sound of his own cell phone, vibrating in his pocket. Jack froze. The vibration throbbed against his thigh, insistent. The ringtone was distorted, stretched thin, like it was echoing through a long tunnel. He dug into his pocket with shaking hands and pulled the phone free. The screen glowed blue-white in the dark. One word flashed across it, unknown. The phone in his hand buzzed harder. He wanted to throw it, to smash it, but his thumb hovered over the screen like it had a mind of its own. He pressed accept. For a moment there was nothing but silence, vast and hollow. Then a breath, wet and ragged, filled his ear. It wasn't coming from the cell phone speaker. It was closer, pressed against his skin, as though lips grazed his earlobe. Jack's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, clutching the cell phone so tightly his knuckles went white. His chest heaved, lungs clawing for air. The voice came next, softer than ever, but inside him now. You answered twice. Now you can never hang up. His throat constricted. He dropped the cell phone, but the voice didn't stop. It didn't need the device anymore. The silence was inside him, clamping around his vocal cords, burrowing into the wet folds of his lungs. He coughed violently, gagging, but no sound escaped. He could feel something thick and warm pooling in his throat, the taste of iron flooding his tongue. Jack crawled backward until his shoulders hit the wall. His hands clutched his neck, nails digging into his skin, but there was nothing to pull free. The voice pulsed through him with every heartbeat. Stay quiet. Forever. The world tilted. His vision dimmed at the edges. He stared at the console one last time. The headset had fallen from the desk completely now, dangling by its cord just inches from the floor. The speaker grill glowed faintly, the ooze dripping steadily from it, in the reflection of the liquid pooled beneath it. Jack saw himself, not the man he was now, shaking and wide-eyed, but himself seated upright at the console, calm, silent, lips pressed shut, headset snug against his ear. His reflection turned its head toward him and smiled faintly, blood staining its teeth. Jack's chest convulsed. His vision went black. When the morning crew arrived, the office was still. Jack's workstation was empty, though his chair had been pushed neatly back under the desk. The console was clean, the headset coiled properly, no trace of liquid, no sign of distress. His notes lay blank, the pen carefully capped. The only strange thing was the phone log. It showed dozens of calls between 3 and 4 a.m., all routed from the same number. Not from outside, not from another line, from Jack's own extension. One of the technicians swore later that when he picked up the receiver to test it, he heard something faint in the background. Not static, not a voice, but the sound of someone swallowing slowly, painfully, as though forcing silence down their throat. The ninth statue. The museum was never meant to be awake at night. Its halls were designed for daylight, for the shuffling of shoes across polished floors, for the murmur of guided tours and the rustle of brochures. After hours, when the visitors were gone and the lights dimmed, the building itself seemed to fold inward, heavy with the weight of centuries pressed into silence. The air was cooler, the marble colder, and every sound carried as though it were being listened to by something more than walls. Amelia knew that silence well. For nearly 5 years she had walked these galleries as part of her job, checking locks, monitoring climate controls, keeping an eye on the treasures entrusted to human hands. Tonight would be her last night. Tomorrow, she would hand in her badge, clear her locker, and step out into a different life. A new job was waiting, with better hours, better pay, and no more nights spent walking endless corridors with nothing but her own echo for company. But she had always loved the quiet. Even when it unnerved her, she moved slowly through the atrium, her flats tapping softly on the stone floor, the sound bouncing up into the vaulted ceiling where banners of past exhibitions still hung like forgotten flags. Her flashlight beam skimmed over display cases, sealed glass boxes housing coins older than her language, jewelry carved for emperors long dead, fragments of mosaics that once lay beneath the sandals of Rome. She passed them all, her eyes drawn inevitably to the farthest gallery, the one tucked behind heavy doors at the very back of the museum, the Eternal Works. That gallery had always been her favorite and her least favorite at once. It housed 8 statues, marble figures carved in the Roman style, each one life-sized and posed in some timeless moment. A scholar bent over a scroll, a mother with a child clasped to her hip, a soldier resting against his shield. They were displayed in a circle around the central floor, lit from above by a ring of recessed lamps. She had memorized their faces, their postures, their faintly cracked surfaces. She could close her eyes and count them without looking. 8. Always 8. Tonight, she told herself, would be no different. The doors whispered open as she pressed her keycard, and the familiar chill of the gallery slid around her like water. Her flashlight cut a white line through the gloom, illuminating the pale curve of a shoulder, the blank stare of stone eyes. The statues waited in their places, silent and solemn, just as they had every night before. Amelia walked the perimeter, her shoes whispering against marble tiles. 1, she counted, the scholar. 2, the mother. 3, the soldier. Her lips shaped the numbers without sound, a private ritual, a way of assuring herself that the world still made sense in this place where stone often felt more alive than flesh. 4, the boy with the lyre. 5, the woman kneeling in prayer. 6, the orator with one arm raised. 7, the hooded figure clutching a lantern. 8, the reclining poet, his face tilted as though listening to a voice only he could hear. She paused, letting the count settle in her chest. 8. And then she saw it. Her eyes slid to the far side of the circle, where a narrow pedestal sat just beyond the arc of the others. It was supposed to be empty. She had walked past it 100 times. Tonight, it wasn't. On it sat a ninth statue. Amelia stopped walking. The sound of her footsteps died instantly, swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. Her breath caught. The figure was slumped, head bowed, arms draped loosely over its knees, not regal like the soldier or serene like the mother. This one was careless, its weight resting awkwardly as though it had simply fallen asleep in place. The carving was detailed, painfully so. The folds of a tunic creased around the waist, the strands of hair pressed against the forehead, the curve of the lips parted slightly as if caught mid-breath. She knew every statue in this gallery. She had memorized them, and there had never been 9. Amelia's mouth went dry. She turned slowly in a circle, shining her light across the familiar faces. 8 in their places, and then the 9th. Impossibly there, impossibly real. Her flashlight beam trembled as she swept it back over the slumped figure. For a moment, she thought she saw its chest rise just faintly, the suggestion of air moving beneath stone ribs. The light shifted, and the illusion vanished. Her pulse raced in her ears. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to steady her voice, even though no one was there to hear it. There were only ever 8, she whispered to herself. 8. Always 8. Her words felt wrong in the air, too sharp against the silence, as though she had spoken in a place that didn't want to be disturbed. She looked again. The 9th statue remained, head bowed, frozen in its careless posture, waiting for her to accept its presence. Amelia's hand shook as she reached for her radio. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the button. She could call security, report the anomaly, let someone else explain why a new statue had appeared in the middle of the night. But what would she say? That a piece of stone had materialized where it had never been? That she had spent years walking these halls and only tonight realized she had miscounted? She closed her eyes, trying to remember every walkthrough, every patrol. 8. Always 8. Her radio crackled faintly as though urging her on. She pressed the button. "Curator," she said, her voice low, echoing off marble. "This is Amelia. There's something you need to see." Her words hung in the vast gallery, swallowed into the air. She released the button. The radio clicked, silent again, and for the first time that night she felt as though she wasn't alone, because across the circle of statues, the 9th figure seemed to be listening. The gallery seemed to inhale her words and hold them there, waiting. Amelia kept her eyes fixed on the 9th figure, afraid that if she blinked, it might change, might lift its head or shift its weight in some almost imperceptible way. Her radio hissed faintly in her hand, then broke the silence with a clipped reply. "On my way," the curator's voice said, calm, detached, the tone of a man for whom nothing was ever strange enough to warrant alarm. Amelia let the radio fall to her side. Her pulse was too loud in her ears, drowning out the distant hum of the museum's ventilation. She glanced back at the circle of statues. The 8 she knew remained as they always had, pale guardians frozen mid-gesture. Only the 9th betrayed her memory. The slumped figure sat in its posture of exhaustion, head bowed, indifferent. She couldn't stop staring at the details, the curve of the cheekbone, the way the fabric of its tunic seemed caught in gravity's pull. It wasn't the stylized perfection of Roman marble. It was too natural, too careless. She whispered to herself again, barely moving her lips. 8. Always 8. A sound broke the stillness, not the echo of her voice this time, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of footsteps approaching from beyond the heavy doors. Leather soles on marble, measured and unhurried. The doors opened with a sigh, spilling a sliver of brighter light into the gallery. The curator entered, tall and precise in his movements, his gray suit immaculate despite the late hour. He carried a flashlight but did not switch it on. The overhead lamps glowed faintly above, enough to paint the statues in half shadow. His gaze swept the gallery, pausing briefly on Amelia before settling on the circle of stone. "You called," he said. His voice echoed faintly, as though even his words were aware of the scale of the room. Amelia swallowed hard, gesturing with the flashlight still trembling in her hand. "There," she said, her voice brittle. 9. There were 8 yesterday. There have always been 8. But now, the curator followed her beam, eyes resting on the slumped figure. For a long moment, he said nothing. Amelia felt her chest tighten, waiting for his surprise, his confusion. She wanted him to confirm her sanity, to acknowledge that what she saw was wrong. Instead, he nodded once, lightly, almost bored. "Yes, 9. Amelia blinked. "What?" 9, he repeated. He stepped further into the circle, hands clasped neatly behind his back. There have always been 9. This one is the indifferent one, the centerpiece of the collection. Her throat tightened. She shook her head violently, her voice cracking. No, that's not true. I've worked this gallery for years. I know them. The scholar, the mother, the soldier, the boy, the kneeling woman, the orator, the hooded one, the poet. 8, not 9. The curator finally looked at her, his expression flat, eyes unreadable in the dim light. Memory plays tricks, particularly in places like this, where stillness breeds repetition. But there have always been 9. Our records confirm it. Amelia's mouth went dry. She turned to the 9th statue again, her flashlight beam quivering across its bowed head. Then why don't I remember it? Why does it look... She stopped herself, unable to finish the thought that clawed at her throat. Why does it look alive? The curator stepped closer to the statue, his shoes clicking softly. He regarded it with a faint tilt of his head, like a man glancing at a painting he had long since grown tired of. This is one of the most important pieces in the collection, a study in neglect, in the human tendency to look away. Most visitors do not even notice it until it is pointed out to them. That is part of its genius. Amelia stared, her hands trembling. The words felt wrong, rehearsed, as though he were reading from a script rather than speaking. She pressed her lips together, whispering again without sound. 8, always 8. The curator moved around the circle, pausing at each statue with clinical interest. The poet is restful, the mother eternal, the soldier proud. But this, he gestured at the 9th with a hand that barely moved. This is truth, indifference embodied. Amelia's eyes burned with frustration. She took a step toward him, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. That wasn't here yesterday. The curator's gaze slid back to her. Then perhaps yesterday you were not looking. Silence stretched between them, brittle as glass. Amelia felt the weight of the statues pressing in, their blank eyes turned toward the center. She imagined them listening, not to the curator, not to her, but to the quiet between their words. She forced herself to step closer to the 9th. The air near it felt colder, the draft of an open tomb. She reached out a hand, stopped inches from the stone, and let her fingers hover there. The curator watched her with detached interest. Touch it, he said softly. Her heart lurched. She pulled her hand back, shaking her head. No, touch it, he repeated. His tone was neither command nor suggestion. It was inevitability. Amelia wrapped her arms around herself, clutching her elbows. She shook her head again, more firmly. There are only 8. The curator smiled faintly. It was not kind. There are 9. The overhead lights flickered once, briefly plunging the gallery into deeper shadow. When they steadied again, the 9th statue seemed different. The tilt of its head, the slackness of its jaw somehow. In the flicker, it had shifted. Just slightly. Amelia's breath caught. The curator clasped his hands behind his back again. 9, he said. His voice echoed in the vaulted chamber. There have always been 9. Amelia could feel the words of the curator circling in her head, each one heavy, deliberate, designed to wear her down. There have always been 9. He said it with such calm assurance that, for a fleeting second, she felt the ground beneath her memory shift. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall every late-night patrol, every solitary count of the statues that had comforted her in their consistency. 8, 8, never 9. When she opened her eyes again, the curator was still standing by the arc of the circle, his face a mask of professional detachment. The 9th statue slumped a few feet away, its presence undeniable, its posture too casual to belong among the solemnity of the others. It looked like it had been placed there without permission, as though someone had sat down and simply never moved again. Her hand tightened around the flashlight until her knuckles ached. She needed to know. Ignoring the curator's watchful eyes, she stepped closer. The marble tiles carried her footsteps like drumbeats in a hollow chamber. The air grew colder as she approached, the beam of her flashlight trembling across the bowed head, the curve of the shoulder, the slack hand resting against the thigh. Up close, the details were overwhelming. Every strand of hair had been carved with impossible precision, curling against the forehead. The eyelids drooped, lashes fine and delicate, not etched with the blunt strokes of a chisel but rendered as if lifted from flesh. Even the lips were parted ever so slightly, catching the faintest shadow. She reached out again, unable to stop herself. The curator did not speak this time. He only watched. Her fingers hovered, then brushed the surface of the statue's forearm. Cold. Of course it was cold. She had expected the smooth chill of marble, the familiar lifelessness of stone. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A resistance. It wasn't the solid, unyielding hardness she had known from every sculpture in the gallery. This felt different, like a layer of stone stretched thin over something softer, something that still had the memory of yielding. Her breath caught. She pressed a little harder, just enough to convince herself she wasn't imagining it. The surface gave, not visibly, not enough to break its stillness, but she felt it, a faint pliancy, like pressing against flesh that had stiffened in cold. Amelia's flashlight slipped in her trembling grip, the beam sliding down the length of the statue's arm. That was when she saw it, a faint line at the wrist, running just beneath the surface. Not a crack in the stone, not the jagged fracture of age, but something smoother, more organic. Avine, her hand flew back as though burned. The flashlight clattered against her leg, its beam jittering wildly across the statue's chest. In that unsteady light, she saw more subtle ridges at the throat, the faint indentation of a collarbone, and along the neck, the suggestion of a pulse frozen mid-throb. She staggered backward, the word torn from her lips before she could stop it. No. The curator's voice followed, calm, certain. Yes. She turned on him, fury rising through the fear. This isn't marble. It's... The words failed her. She couldn't say it aloud, couldn't name what she knew it to be. Perception, the curator supplied smoothly, stepping closer. That is all it is. Stone or flesh, memory or imagination. It depends on the viewer. That is what makes the indifferent one so powerful. Amelia shook her head, stepping farther back, away from both him and the statue. I know what I felt. The curator's smile was small, unconvincing, but his eyes gleamed in the half-light. And yet, here it remains, silent, eternal. If you walk away, Amelia, tomorrow you will remember only that there were 9. You will tell yourself you were mistaken. That fatigue clouded your mind. She could barely breathe. She turned her flashlight on the statue again, steadying the beam this time. The details leapt out at her with cruel clarity. The hand dangling by its side bore fingernails short, blunt, the kind she had seen tapping nervously against a desk. The skin was mottled, gray-white, too smooth in some places, too rough in others, as though whatever process had captured it hadn't finished its work. Her stomach twisted. She thought of the night guard who had vanished a week ago, the man everyone assumed had simply quit without warning. She remembered his tired posture, the way he sometimes leaned against the counter, head bowed, eyes half closed with exhaustion. The resemblance was undeniable. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "This isn't art." The curator's answer came without hesitation. All art is sacrifice. Amelia staggered back, nearly tripping over her own feet. The statues around her seemed closer now, their blank eyes pressing against her skin, their silence deafening. She swung her light across the circle. Each figure remained still, eternal, but she felt them watching her, complicit in the presence of the 9th. Her gaze snapped back to the indifferent one. The flashlight caught its lips just so, and for a single heart-stopping instant, she thought she saw them move. The faintest tremor, the ghost of a sigh that never reached the air. Her knees went weak. She clutched the flashlight to her chest, its beam quivering wildly across the room. The curator stepped closer, his shoes whispering against marble. His voice was softer now, almost kind, though the words themselves chilled her to the bone. "You should not linger." The statues do not enjoy being counted. They prefer to be accepted, to be seen. Amelia's breath came ragged. She couldn't take her eyes off the 9th. Its posture was unchanged, head bowed, arms slack, but she knew. Beneath that thin layer of stone, something remembered warmth, something remembered breath. She backed toward the door, each step heavy, the beam of her flashlight refusing to leave the slumped figure. Her voice was a whisper meant only for herself, a tether to keep her grounded. 8. Always 8. But in the silence that followed, another whisper slid across the gallery, low and steady, impossible to place. 9. The gallery did not feel like stone and air anymore. It felt like a mouth, and Amelia was inside it. The silence had thickened, so that even her own breath seemed stolen away as soon as it left her lips. Her flashlight trembled in her grip. Its beam caught on the bowed head of the ninth statue, illuminating the curve of cheekbones that were too familiar, too recent, to belong to a figure carved 2,000 years ago. She took a step closer, though every instinct begged her to retreat. The curator's presence at her side no longer anchored her. It pressed her forward, as if his stillness left no other option but to continue. The circle of statues loomed higher, their white eyes unblinking, their marble arms poised as though they were waiting to applaud some performance only she could not see. Amelia raised the beam to the statue's face, and there it was. The nose, slightly crooked from an old break. The mouth, curved in that tired half-smile she had seen countless times behind the guard's desk. The faint indent at the chin where he sometimes rested his hand when he was fighting sleep. She knew this face. She had spoken to it, laughed with it, shared coffee during long night shifts. It was him. Her knees threatened to give way. She staggered back a step, her heels scraping across the marble floor, the sound echoing too loudly. "No," she breathed, but the word collapsed in her throat, flimsy against the weight of the gallery. The curator finally moved. He circled the statue with a slow, deliberate pace, hands folded neatly behind his back. His voice carried with the softness of a man giving a lecture to an empty room. Recognition is always the most difficult part, but necessary. What is art, if not the preservation of what must otherwise fade? Amelia turned on him, voice shaking. "That's not art, that's—" She faltered. Her throat refused the word. Murder felt too small, sacrifice too neat. This was something worse, something older. The curator smiled faintly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Transcendence," he supplied. "These halls are built to outlast us. You have always known that, Amelia. We are temporary. They are eternal. But sometimes, the two may overlap. Sometimes the temporary can be convinced to stay." She shook her head violently, raising the flashlight like a shield. "No, he was alive last week. He was here." Yes. The curator's agreement was so calm, so flat, that it cut deeper than denial. He paused at the statue's shoulder, tilting his head as though examining brushstrokes. "And now he is here. That is the beauty of it. Nothing lost, only transformed." Amelia's skin crawled. Her breath grew shallow, ragged, the air too heavy to pull into her lungs. She wanted to run, to flee the gallery, but the circle of statues pressed closer in her mind, hemming her in, their blank eyes trained on her every movement. Her flashlight beam caught the statue's lips again. For a fraction of a second, she thought they trembled. A trick of the light, perhaps, or the exhaustion clouding her vision. But she couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the thin stone crust, something was still there. Something trapped, straining to move. Her voice broke. "Why me? Why show me this?" The curator's gaze flicked to her, his eyes sharp in the half-light. "Because you are leaving, and those who leave must choose what they take with them." He gestured to the circle. "Some take memory, some take silence, and some take permanence." Her heart lurched. She backed away, nearly stumbling against the plinth of another statue. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this." The curator stepped closer, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried. Want is irrelevant. Every gallery hungers for continuity. Every collection demands expansion. The ninth is never final, Amelia. You know this. You have felt it. The words landed like stones in her chest. She thought of all those nights she had walked the museum's halls, the way the silence seemed alive, pressing against her skin. She thought of how the statues sometimes seemed to shift in her peripheral vision, how she had counted them again and again as though the act itself mattered. Perhaps she had been preparing for this all along, rehearsing her role in the ritual of stillness. Her flashlight dipped, the beam trembling across the floor. The marble tiles gleamed faintly with her reflection, and for one dizzying instant she thought she saw not herself but another version of her, frozen, lips parted in the same terrified breath she now held in her chest. She dropped the light. It clattered against the stone, rolling in a lazy circle, casting dizzy arcs of illumination across the statues. Each beam revealed a face, a hand, a gaze all fixed, all eternal. And in that sweep of light, she could have sworn she saw another figure among them, one she hadn't counted before. "Nina, Tim," she gasped. lunging to snatch the flashlight. When she raised it again, the gallery was as it had been. 8 she knew, the 9th she feared, and the curator, standing at the center, watching her with eyes as cold and polished as the marble floor. "Do not count," he said softly. "Counting is a refusal. Acceptance is the only way forward." Amelia's hands shook so violently the flashlight beam quivered like a heartbeat on the wall. She clutched it close to her chest, whispering to herself, her mantra breaking apart with every breath. 8, always 8, always. The curator stepped nearer, his voice a whisper now, but heavy, unavoidable. 9. And the word did not come only from him. It came from the walls, from the stone, from the statues themselves, whispered in the groan of old marble, in the sigh of cold air. 9. "Oh, Amelia's lips parted. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The gallery's air pressed tighter around her, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting. Amelia clutched the flashlight so hard the plastic casing groaned beneath her grip. She wanted to run, to bolt through the heavy doors and never look back, but her legs would not obey. It was as if the marble beneath her shoes had grown heavy with centuries of stillness, rooting her in place. The curator's figure loomed at the edge of her vision, precise, measured, as though he too had been carved into the gallery long ago. His voice uncoiled softly, wrapping around her like smoke. "You feel it, don't you? The weight of them. The stillness. It does not repel you. It beckons." Amelia shook her head, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "No," she whispered. Her throat was too dry for anything louder. "I'm leaving." "Leaving?" The word was almost tender, almost amused. He tilted his head, studying her like a misplaced artifact. "There is no leaving. This place remembers its caretakers, Amelia. You fed it with your presence, your footsteps, your vigilance. You thought you were guarding it, but it was watching you all along." Her flashlight beam swept across the circle of statues. Their eyes caught the light in dull gleams, their mouths forever frozen mid-breath. And yet, in the silence, she thought she could hear them. A faint intake, a sigh, a murmur of voices just beneath hearing. 9. She stumbled backward, the beam quivering across the slumped figure she could not unsee as her colleague. His familiar features were locked in exhaustion. His lips parted as though he might rise at any moment and beg her for help, but the stone refused to move. Her own breath fractured. "Why him?" she rasped. "Why any of them?" The curator's reply was soft, reverent. "Because eternity does not choose the willing. It chooses the unnoticed, the ones no one will miss when they do not come home. That is how collections grow, quietly, seamlessly." A drop of something cold slid down her spine. She realized the statues around her were not strangers. She began to recognize hints of people she had known on night shifts long past, faces she had forgotten, names she had let slip. Their postures were ordinary, casual, as if each had been caught in a single weary gesture and preserved. Her stomach clenched. She whispered, as though admitting it would break her in two. They were all here, all of them. Before, the curator's smile flickered in the dimness. Not cruel, not kind, simply inevitable. And now, so are you. The words struck her harder than a blow. She dropped the flashlight. It spun on the floor, casting wild arcs of light that painted every statue with fleeting motion. For a heartbeat, they all seemed alive, heads tilted, eyes turning, mouths ready to speak. The gallery thrummed with their silence, with their unspoken demand. Amelia staggered back toward the door, her hand fumbling for the brass handle, but it was locked. She rattled it once, twice, the sound ringing like a desperate bell across the chamber. Behind her, the whisper rose, a single word repeated again and again, layered upon itself until it became a chant. 9, 9, 9. Her hand slipped on the handle. She turned, pressing her back to the door. The statues ringed her, unmoving, eternal. And at the center, the indifferent one seemed closer now, as though the circle had tightened, drawing her inward. Her breath broke in sobs. "I'm not one of you," she pleaded. "I'm not," but her words died as she felt the first touch. A chill, faint as a breeze, brushed her cheek, then another across her hand. Invisible fingers, patient, insistent. The air itself pressed her forward, step by step, until she stood before the 9th statue. Its bowed head loomed above her, its lips parted in eternal fatigue. For an instant, she swore the statue exhaled. A gust of air touched her face, smelling faintly of dust and something human. She closed her eyes, trembling. The curator's voice was the last thing she heard. "Welcome to permanence." The flashlight sputtered and died. The gallery swallowed her scream. Ow. Morning came. The staff arrived to open the museum, their voices carrying easily through the marble corridors. The gallery of eternal works lay in its usual hush, bathed in the pale light of dawn filtering through high windows. 8 statues stood as they always had. The scholar, the mother, the soldier, the boy, the kneeling woman, the orator, the hooded one, the poet, and the 9th, the centerpiece, the indifferent one, sat slumped in eternal exhaustion. The guards did not question it. The record said 9. The catalog said 9. The plaques on the wall said 9. And so, there were 9. But if any of them had looked closer than comfort would allow, they might have noticed the curve of her cheek, the way her hands were clasped in desperate prayer, the faint parting of her lips frozen mid-plea. They might have known her name. They might have whispered it. Instead, the gallery remained silent, the statues watching, the circle unbroken. 9. Always 9. And that is where we leave each story tonight. 7 whispers, 7 warnings, drifting now into your quiet room. Perhaps you'll forget them when you sleep. Perhaps not. Sometimes the mind closes its eyes, but the body remembers the rhythm on the door, the breath at your shoulder, the statue's gaze that never truly lifts. If you are listening in bed and your room feels just a little heavier than before, don't worry. It's only the stories. They linger. They wait. That's what stories do. Until the next night, keep your lights low, keep your ears open, and remember, silence is never really empty. Someone, somewhere, is always listening.